heart. We know it's there. We can all feel it working inside. And its existence has been documented for thousands of years. But for most of medical history, we had no idea what the heart actually did, much less any hope of fixing it when something went wrong. Hi, I'm Noah Wiley. Welcome to Mavericks, Miracles in Medicine, the stories of people whose remarkable medical breakthroughs have saved countless lives and often stirred up firestorms of controversy along the way. Our program begins with Jim Snow, a man whose damaged heart will test all that modern medicine has to offer. And through his story, we'll trace the twisted path of medical discovery that's brought us to the point where a badly damaged heart can be repaired or even replaced.
Dr. James Snow is 70 years old. Until a year ago, he enjoyed almost perfect health. But after practicing medicine for over 40 years, he's about to take on a very unfamiliar new role, that of a surgical patient.
Unfortunately, I hadn't had anyone listen to my heart for about 15 years, and then had a dental procedure done.
Snow developed an infection known as bacterial endocarditis.
10 days later, I developed the fever that goes along with the endocarditis.
That infection began to eat away at Snow's heart valve, which is what brought him to heart surgeon Stephen Colvin.
The infection that took place in the heart caused particles to build up on the mitral valve, that the cords have ruptured from the infection and the leaflet is flopping around.
In most hospitals, doctors would open Snow's entire chest and replace his damaged valve. But Snow has come here because Dr. Colvin will do what few other surgeons can. In a cutting-edge procedure, he will actually rebuild Snow's valve, and he'll do it through a tiny incision in the side of Snow's chest.
What we're going to have to do is repair the part of the valve that has the ruptured cords on it, fix the tissue together, and then we'll support the area around the valve with a band. So we'll do
Surgery like this, in fact any surgery, depends on the precise and detailed knowledge of the human body that we have today. But until the mid-16th century, even physicians had only a sketchy and largely inaccurate knowledge of human anatomy. And it might have remained that way if not for an arrogant, ambitious medical student, so obsessed with understanding the inner landscape of the human body that he was willing to risk ridicule, jail, and even his life for this knowledge.
You see, dissection of human bodies had been forbidden ever since the beginning of known time, so that everything that was known about human bodies was derived from animal dissections.
But when a young Belgian named Andreas Vesalius began his medical studies in Paris in the 1530s, he desperately wanted to learn for himself the secrets hidden inside the human body.
So what he did is that in the middle of the night, he went into Parisian cemeteries and actually stole bodies there, stole bones, so that he could examine the bones.
He was breaking the law. The biggest challenge that Vesalius tells us was not so much the authorities, even though he shouldn't have been doing this. It was dealing with the dogs that were roaming the cemeteries.
And in fact, in his later account, he tells us that one night, in the middle of the night, he went into a Parisian cemetery with a friend when they were attacked by savage dogs.
In 1537, Vesalius left Paris for the renowned medical school at Padua in northern Italy, where he finished his studies.
Shortly after getting his medical degree there, he was actually appointed the head of the Department of Anatomy and Surgery. And for 5 years, he spent non-stop dissecting human bodies.
Although dissection was far from a popular enterprise, at Padua bodies were a little easier to come by.
The fact is that in the late 15th century, I think it was 1489 or something like this, Pope Sixtus IV published a papal bull in which he said that local bishops could decide to give bodies of people who died intestate or in prison or whatever to anatomists and to artists.
Day after day, Vesalius would stand in the middle of his operating theater at the university, surrounded by students arranged in tiers above him. The air thick with mystery and the smell of decaying flesh, he would cut slowly into the cadaver on the table before him, unlocking the secrets of the body's hidden core. And although he was no longer in violation of church law, Vesalius's crime was no less serious, for he was thumbing his nose at the previous 1,400 years of medical dogma. Until now, everything that was known and taught about anatomy had come out of the writings of one man, the great Galen.
Galen was a 2nd century Greek physician who had an enormous output, did a lot of work, did a lot of experimentation with animals, and he extrapolated a lot of what he learned from animals to humans.
Vesalius really was trained in classic Galenic anatomy and Galenic medicine. But when he went to Padua and started dissecting bodies, he found that there were many things that he was seeing with his own 2 eyes that were not in agreement with what the Galenic texts were teaching. And he couldn't figure it out. He was absolutely lost.
For centuries, Galen's word had been treated more like religious gospel than science, and no one had been willing to challenge it.
Now, Galen was the most powerful medical figure of his time. What was paradoxical about Galen was that he was a wonderful physiologist, but at the same time, he was a bombastic, authoritative fellow who essentially made things up if there was a gap in his knowledge.
But how could Galen's flaws have gone unnoticed for 1,400 years? Well, first of all, throughout the Dark Ages, no one did enough research to know. And when the study of human anatomy did finally begin, the few dissections that did take place were done by lowly barbers, cutting while the physicians sat on a throne reading aloud from Galen. Now Vesalius was doing his own dissections, seeing for himself what was there, and worse, saying that the emperor had no clothes, that the great Galen was wrong.
Vesalius comes along, and he does something that seems to be totally out of keeping with what everybody believes. So he's going to be reviled by the anatomists. Vesalius's contribution and Vesalius's sin were one and the same, that he dared to disagree with Galen, and he not only dared to disagree with Galen, but he dared to point out that Galen had said fraudulent things. He accused Galen of dishonesty. And of course, can you imagine what that must have done to the doctors of the time?
Already, Vesalius had earned a reputation as a heretic among his colleagues. But in 1543, at the age of 29, he decided to take an even bigger risk. He was going to go public, to set the record straight, and to show the world the fruits of what he had found. Vesalius had decided to create a book, the first ever atlas of human anatomy. And this wasn't going to be just any book.
It was over 700 pages long, with over 200 illustrations. And he entitled this De Humani Corpus Fabrica Librum Septem, which actually means concerning the structure of the human body in 7 books. And this was this fabulous book. In fact, it has been hailed by some of the greatest physicians as the greatest medical book ever published.
It broke new ground in the way the body was presented. It's a very beautiful, big book with gorgeous plates in them. Some of these plates are figures showing the muscles, and the skin is removed and the muscles are shown and in successive plates all the way down to the skeleton. They are beautifully done. They're beautifully executed in the best artistic quality of the day.
Although Vesalius continued to be ridiculed in some quarters, his book was heralded as a masterpiece and gained him international notoriety.
The book is not only a triumph of anatomical study, it's a triumph of the art of making books. So what we've got here is a landmark in pedagogy, a landmark in anatomy, and a landmark in the art of creating a book.
Without the Fabrica, I don't know that we'd know very much about Vesalius. I think people were so taken with the beauty of the Fabrica that he was heralded as the father of modern anatomy.
When we next see Dr. Snow, he'll be undergoing what today is a virtually routine procedure. But in 1929, it shocked the medical world and made an outcast of its inventor.
In 24 hours, Jim Snow is going to have his heart valve repaired.
Just putting a tiny plastic tube in, you'll feel a little push.
So today, cardiologist Fred Feit is doing a procedure to make sure that there are no other problems with Jim's heart.
So just put a little dye in the catheter so it can see.
It's called cardiac catheterization, and it involves injecting dye into the blood vessels around the heart to make them easier to see on X-ray.
Okay. Don't breathe, hold your breath. Breathe.
Today, cardiac catheterization is virtually routine. Last year, Dr. Feit and his staff performed almost 1,000 of them. So it's hard to imagine that only 100 years ago, all of this was not only impossible, it was unthinkable.
You know, if you ever watch any of these horror films from the 30s, which are my favorites, there's always a point in the film where someone says about the mad professor, we shouldn't go there. This is something that God has ordained, and man should not go beyond that. And there was that kind of feeling about the heart.
As late as 1880, one of Europe's most eminent surgeons is rumored to have said, "A surgeon who tries to suture a heart wound deserves to lose the esteem of his colleagues." And even in the 1920s, it would take someone with imagination, courage, and even a little madness to ignore such a stern warning. That description certainly fit a young German doctor named Werner Forssmann.
Forssmann, as a student, had seen this drawing of a tube inserted in the jugular vein of a horse. What was being done here were the original measurements of blood pressure.
Forssmann told me many, many years later, when I interviewed him, that this was the impetus for what he did.
In fact, Forssmann became consumed with the idea that if you could put a tube into the human heart, you could use it to deliver medication, or even to inject dye that would make the heart easier to see on X-ray. So, in 1929, when he started his residency at a Red Cross hospital in the town of Eberswald, he was anxious to test his theory.
He had talked it over with colleagues and with his professors and with the head of the hospital where he was interning, and they had all forbidden him to experiment on anyone. And so Forssmann got more and more obsessed with this idea.
He decided that if he couldn't experiment on patients, he would use the only human subject he had, himself. But he knew he would have to conduct his experiment in secret. Now his problem was getting the equipment he needed, which was kept under lock and key in the operating room under the watchful eye of a nurse, one Gerda Ditzen.
He convinced Nurse Dietzen through multiple dinners and, as he said, prowling around like a cat. And she agreed and was enthusiastic, but she also thought she was going to be the subject.
Forssmann, of course, had other ideas.
Forssmann went to the operating room, mapped out everything, and strapped Nurse Dietzen to the table, operating room table, so that she'd be prepared in her mind to be the subject. But he had a different motive in mind. He wanted her out of his way, and he went off to the tray out of her sight, nicked the skin in his elbow crease, and cut into the vein, and inserted the tube. He unstrapped Nurse Dietzen, who, to her horror from expectation, found that he had done it on himself, not on her, and she had been duped.
Without explanation, he grabbed her by the arm and ran out of the operating room.
They went into the basement where the X-ray department was, and there he wanted to have an X-ray taken to prove that the tube was in his heart.
But then a friend came in and looked and saw what this crazy thing that he was doing and was going to try and pull the catheter out. And Forsman said he had to kick him in the shins to stop him from pulling the catheter out.
Forsman was yelling, 9-9, get out of here, leave me alone, let me get the x-ray.
And for all anyone knew at the time, I mean, by shoving a catheter up there, I mean, he could have easily developed an arrhythmia and died on the spot.
But Forsman did get his x-ray, this x-ray, in which you can see that he had succeeded. And armed with this incontrovertible proof, Forsman believed that he was truly on his way to making medical history. He left the little hospital in Eberswald and moved to Berlin, where he published the results of his experiment and secured a position at the famous Charité hospital.
His superior at the time was a very famous and imperious German surgeon named Ferdinand Sauerbruch.
Sauerbruch was sort of the Pope of German surgery at that time. Forsman arrived assuming that he would be able to carry forth his research that he couldn't do in a small hospital in Eberswald, but things just didn't go Forsman's way.
Poor Forsman, when he was in the Charité clinic in Berlin with his boss Sauerbruch, I mean, he was felt to be an idiot. I mean, that he was doing something so outrageous that no one would ever think of doing.
Sauerbruch became incensed at him. He said, what is this? This is some kind of a trick for a circus?
It was in a short time, a matter of weeks to months, that Sauerbruch fired him. And back to Eberswald, Forsman went.
Forsman did continue his research a bit longer, catheterizing himself a total of 9 times, experimenting with injecting dye into his heart to better visualize it on X-ray, and publishing several more papers. But his work continued to be ignored by the medical establishment. It took nearly 2 decades, but the medical world finally caught up with Forsman. In New York City in 1949, 2 American doctors named Andre Cournand and Dickinson Richards found one of Forsman's old papers and picked up where he had left off. This time, medicine was ready.
When Cournand and Richards started to work, the early cardiac operations were being done, and people needed this information that putting a catheter in the heart would provide.
We attended the first conference with Dr. Cournand presenting the right-sided catheterization. Our jaws dropped. This was something like, like seeing the man on the moon. It was received with extreme excitement. Here in cardiology, suddenly, we had a tool to diagnose and treat.
Finally, in 1956, after being humiliated and forgotten for 25 years, Werner Forsman took his place beside Cournand and Richards to accept the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his extraordinary work.
When we return, Jim Snow's surgical team prepares for the invisible enemy that threatens every patient. And we'll meet the young 19th century doctor who was condemned for discovering it.
While Dr. Snow is prepared for his surgery, the hospital must prepare as well. Before Dr. Colvin can make his first cut, an army of manpower and technology is brought to bear to engage the invisible but deadly enemy that could threaten Jim Snow's life: germs. In every modern hospital, thousands of man-hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars are spent every year in an endless battle against those little unseen adversaries. But as late as the mid-1800s, nobody even knew what germs were, much less that they transmitted disease. So, as you might imagine, the standards of cleanliness then were not what they are today.
Surgeons generally would operate in butcher's uniforms with unsterilized instruments with dried blood on them. And so and no one thought that this sterility or cleaning instruments really had any value.
It would take a surly young Hungarian named Ignaz Semmelweis to show the world just how dangerous this really was. In the winter of 1846, Vienna was one of the meccas of the medical world, and the Allgemeines Krankenhaus was its most famous hospital. There, young Semmelweis was a resident in charge of the first obstetrical clinic. For months, he had been tortured by a problem. Many of the new mothers under his care were dying of a disease known as childbed fever.
There were hundreds of thousands of mothers dying in Europe every single year. No one knew why. So that became the great puzzle that all of the professors of obstetrics in Europe were looking at and had come up with all sorts of ideas about.
Some believed their illness was caused by fear, others that it had to do with whether or not the young women were married, and still others that it might be caused by some mysterious halo clinging to the doctors. Whatever the cause, Semmelweis became determined to find it. The first thing he noticed was particularly perplexing.
What was strange about it was that there were two lying-in clinics, one of which was handled mainly by the physicians of the day, and the other by the midwives. The clinic that was handled mainly by midwives had a much lower rate of death among these poor women.
Semmelweis was confounded by this difference. What was it about the doctor's ward that made the death rate so much higher? He set about conducting a series of experiments, but he was unable to isolate the cause, and the death rate in his ward kept on growing. Semmelweis was despondent. Then one day, in the kind of accident that characterizes so much of medical discovery, he found his solution.
He had a colleague named Kolechka who nicked his finger on an autopsy of one of these women, and Kolechka became infected and died. And so even though Semmelweis didn't know anything about germs or germ theory of disease, he suddenly realized that there was some type of a poison that was causing this condition.
Semmelweis saw in a flash of clarity what was happening.
So these students would go and perform these autopsies on these dead women, and they would stick their hands into the wounds. They saw no reason to wash the gunk off their hands. They would go into the students' ward and examine these women who had just given birth and who had these open wounds from the delivery.
So the doctors were carrying the germs from one patient to another on their dirty hands. They were killing their own patients. Semmelweis would write to a colleague, "God only knows the number of women I have consigned prematurely to the grave." Semmelweis lost no time in instituting a strict cleanliness policy in his ward, forcing all the doctors to wash their hands in a potent solution of chlorinated lime. Almost immediately, the death rate began to drop, apparent proof that Semmelweis was right. But far from making him a hero, his revelation was angrily rejected by his colleagues.
There were a series of reasons that that could not possibly be accepted, and one of them was that to really understand this concept, you had to know certain principles of science that hadn't yet been discovered.
I mean, today it's very easy for us to look at this and say, oh, weren't they stupid? What a terrible thing. But this was the way this was done in the 19th century. No one thought there was anything wrong with it.
Semmelweis let them know in no uncertain terms that there was, and that they were to blame for the women's deaths.
So you get this man in their midst telling them all that they were murderers, and by refusing to accept his doctrine that they were just going to kill more women, and had been killing women always since the beginnings of their careers. So he was reviled.
Facing scorn and ridicule, Semmelweis sank into a deep depression. He quit his job and returned to Hungary.
Well, you know, sometimes it's very bad to be right. But when you're right, and the rightness of what you've discovered makes others feel guilty, and you throw it in their faces instead of presenting it to them either scientifically or perhaps diplomatically, you can expect that the roof is going to cave in on your head.
In Semmelweis's case, one might well say that it did. The medical establishment rejected his accusations as the ravings of a lunatic, and in the end, he did lose his mind and died a broken man in a mental institution. It was 30 years after his death that he finally received the recognition he deserved. The Viennese who had reviled him claimed him as one of their own, and the Hungarians memorialized him in his hometown of Pest.
A statue was erected in his honor, and the statue shows him standing tall with a book under his arm and a newly delivered mother sitting at his feet, holding a child and looking up adoringly at him.
He actually did make a significant discovery, but it was left to others, to finally adopt it. He's one of the great tragic figures in medicine.
Our patient, Jim Snow, will be in a deep sleep before his surgeon makes the first cut. But when we come back, we'll explore the gruesome world of surgery before anesthesia.
Every precaution has been taken and preparation made for Dr. Snow's surgery.
Good morning. Good morning. John Ostrowski, how are you? Any history of diabetes?
Soon, the 5-hour operation to repair his damaged heart valve will begin.
So we're going to get started very soon. Okay, going to bring you into the operating room.
But before the surgeon lays a finger on his patient, Dr. Ostrowski, the anesthesiologist, will connect him to a battery of monitors, IVs, gauges, and gas canisters.
I'm going to give you some medication through the intravenous, and you'll drift off to sleep, and we will see you later on today.
So just a little oxygen to breathe, okay?
During the 5-hour surgery, Dr. Ostrowski will be able to control and monitor the precise level of anesthesia and the effect it's having on the patient.
Nice deep breaths. Starting to feel like you've had a glass of wine yet, or not quite?
No.
No, okay. Just relax and think of some nice, pleasant thoughts, perhaps where your next vacation's going to be. And we'll take care of the rest, okay? Dr. Snow? Okay, very good.
Having surgery is just plain terrifying. Will something go wrong? Will there be complications? The only thing we take for granted is that while the surgery is going on, we'll be blissfully asleep, feeling no pain. Now, imagine having to go through an operation with no anesthesia whatsoever. Until the mid-1800s, that's what every surgical patient had to look forward to.
Sometimes the surgeon would have to drag you in by the neck, but you'd go to a room, usually either on the top floor of a hospital or in the basement, because that way the outside world couldn't hear your screaming. Often you were trussed like a chicken getting ready for roasting so that your limbs and the rest of your body was immobile, or 6 or so burly men would come along and hold you down. The physical pain was maybe over quickly. What was particularly horrifying was that the mental pain went on for the rest of your life. People talked about the fact that they couldn't get the sound of their limb falling on the floor out of their mind.
Because the pain was so great, speed became the most prized quality in a surgeon.
Dr. Robert Liston was one of the great speed demons of surgery. He could amputate a leg, and if you took a pinch of snuff, you would miss the amputation. But all surgeons of the time had to work that quickly because the pain of a surgical operation without anesthesia is so severe that you could easily die of shock. Very few people can take that type of intense pain for more than a few seconds.
Finally, in the mid-1800s, the era of surgery on conscious patients was about to come to a merciful end. On a chilly fall day in 1846, Dr. John Warren, senior surgeon at the prestigious Massachusetts General Hospital, stood in his operating theater, surrounded by several of his students and colleagues. At noon, he would remove a small tumor from the neck of a young man named Abbott. For Warren, a veteran surgeon, this was to be a relatively simple operation. It would, however, change the face of surgery forever. The man of the hour was one William Morton, an opportunistic young medical student, part-time dentist, and false teeth manufacturer, who had managed to convince Dr. Warren to permit him to demonstrate his newly discovered remedy for surgical pain.
Warren prepared the patient in front of the audience of doctors and students in an amphitheater and waited for Dr. Morton, who didn't show.
And then they waited and they looked at their watches and where is Morton? I mean, this is his big moment. This is Massachusetts General Hospital and he's late. Finally, he came running up the stairs just as Dr. Warren had the scalpel ready to go. And Dr. Warren bowed, and with all the sarcasm at his command, he said, "Your patient is ready, sir."
With slow, deliberate movements, Morton produced a strangely shaped glass contraption of his own making, which, unbeknownst to Warren, he had only finished that very morning. The room filled with the smell of aromatic oils as Morton placed the apparatus over the nervous patient's face and began to administer his potion. As Mr. Abbott's hands dropped to his sides and he fell into a deep sleep, Morton turned to Dr. Warren and, as if to return his sarcasm, said, "Sir, your patient is ready."
And Dr. Warren performed the operation in total silence, in what we might call beautiful silence, because there was only the relaxed, deep breathing of the patient to be heard in the ether dome.
During the surgery, he appeared to show no signs of pain or reaction, was calm, which was unlike patients that Dr. Warren would have operated on before, and to everyone's astonishment, showed no evidence that he had felt anything.
When the operation was through, Dr. Warren addressed the waiting audience and said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug."
And with that, a new era had begun. Morton had invented a substance that would single-handedly change the face of surgery. At least, that's how he wanted it to look. As it was, the substance in his flask, the smell disguised by perfume, was nothing more than ether, a substance which had been known for hundreds of years. In fact, there were two anesthetic substances around at the time, ether and nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas. And both were very popular as recreational drugs. Cheap and easily accessible, they had become a favorite of teenagers, medical students, and the upper classes.
People came through in traveling shows as a form of entertainment and used ether or nitrous oxide and invited participants from the audience to come up and breathe the gases.
So both ether and nitrous were everywhere, yet no one seemed to realize that they were looking at a remedy for the torture of surgical pain. Finally, a dentist named Horace Wells did. Wells had participated in a laughing gas demonstration at a country fair.
Horace Wells noticed that one of his co-participants had gashed his leg on stage and never felt any pain or reaction to it. So he wondered, could this be used in his practice in dentistry?
So why isn't Wells credited with the discovery of anesthesia? Well, when he went to Mass General to do a demonstration of painless dentistry, things didn't go so well.
Unfortunately, he didn't use a sufficient amount of nitrous oxide, and the patient experienced pain, and everybody ridiculed him.
And who was there to witness this failure? Wells's former partner, our friend William Morton. Morton, who had had a rich career as a con man before going into medicine, was always looking for a new way to make a buck, and he immediately saw a gold mine. But he would need help, so off he went to visit his former chemistry teacher, the world-renowned chemist Charles Jackson.
They had a very carefully worded discussion in which Morton tried to extract as much information as he could about nitrous oxide. Dr. Jackson said, "Well, instead of using nitrous oxide, which is a little hard to control, what you really should use is ether, sulfuric ether. One dose will really put someone out."
So now all the pieces were in place. Morton had gotten the idea of painless dentistry from Wells and the idea to use ether from Jackson. He was ready for his big debut.
He was a con man, but sometimes science needs a con man. And I think that in any case, Horace Wells needed someone with the kind of greed and avarice that William Morton brought to the unwilling collaboration that led to the discovery of anesthetics.
When word spread about the painless surgery at Mass General, Morton, Wells, and Jackson all scrambled to take full credit, and Morton, not surprisingly, tried to cash in. But try as he might, he never managed to see a single dime from the discovery, and it ended up ruining his life.
He sank lower and lower until he was not much more than a beggar at the end of his life, and an article came out in Atlantic Monthly magazine that barely mentioned his contribution to the discovery of ether, gave all the credit to Dr. Charles Jackson, and this crushed him.
Soon after, while riding through a New York City park with his wife, Morton suffered some sort of seizure, jumped from their carriage, and threw himself into the lake. His wife rushed him to the hospital, but he was dead by the time they arrived.
The chief surgeon showing the students through the wards noticed Morton, and he sort of introduced him posthumously to his students, and he said, "Gentlemen, you see before you a man who has done more to relieve suffering than any American who has ever lived."
It's ironic that a substance that would come to alleviate pain for generations of patients seemed to carry with it a curse that left such suffering in its wake. In the end, Wells and Jackson fared no better than Morton. Wells ended up committing suicide at the age of 33, and Jackson went mad and died in a mental institution.
So the discovery, I don't mean to turn this into Greek mythology, but it was almost as though pain were some kind of god that had received a death blow from these three men, but on the way down, cut each of them down too, because there was something haunting in the way that none of them came out unscathed.
When we next see Jim Snow, his doctors will have to stop his heart to perform their complex surgery. And we'll meet the obsessed physician who spent his life figuring out how to do it.
It's 9 a.m. Jim Snow is sleeping peacefully under the watchful eye of the OR staff.
Okay, so we're just making the incision in the chest, between the ribs.
Dr. Colvin can't operate on a moving target. So before he can repair Jim's valve, he needs to stop his heart.
Heart's very big, heart's very bouncy.
Now, the biggest, most impressive toy in the operating room comes into play, the heart-lung machine.
So that's the arterial cannula for the heart-lung machine to bring oxygenated blood to the patient. Drop the table, please.
The heart-lung machine, or cardiopulmonary bypass, is exactly what it sounds like. It takes over the functions of the heart and lungs while the patient's heart is stopped.
And it's going to then go flatline.
Over the next 3 hours, the heart-lung machine will oxygenate and circulate Jim Snow's blood, while Dr. Colvin works on a perfectly stationary heart.
I want to make sure there are no particles around. Keep on washing it off with water.
Finally, the repair is complete, and it's time to shock Jim Snow's heart back to life.
Shut it off. Okay, so we're off the heart-lung machine. The patient is perfusing his own body. The heart's beating well.
To understand just how extraordinary this really is, here's all you need to know. As recently as the 1960s, when Dr. Colvin started his medical training, open-heart surgery was a new frontier. While surgery on the rest of the body had progressed in leaps and bounds during the first half of the 20th century, heart surgery lagged woefully behind for one simple reason. You couldn't stop the heart without killing the patient. Few felt the frustration of their impotence more than a young surgical resident named John Gibbon. In the fall of 1930, Gibbon was doing a fellowship under the eminent surgeon Edward Churchill at Massachusetts General Hospital. One night, he was asked to stay up and observe a woman who had developed a massive blood clot in her pulmonary artery.
Jack sat there watching this poor lady get sicker and sicker, and as time passed, she became bluer and bluer.
Well, this woman died. It was a young woman. And it really troubled Gibbon that he couldn't do anything about it. He said, you know, if we could only bypass the heart, bypass the circulation so that we can open up that pulmonary artery safely, pull out the clots, these patients wouldn't have to die.
The idea of creating a machine that would make this possible was firmly planted in the back of Gibbon's mind. But for now, he had just married Dr. Churchill's lab technician, Maylie, and they were off to start a life together.
After his first experience at the Mass General, he went back to Philadelphia. He received good hospital appointments, and he began to practice surgery.
And it might have remained that way, if not for the memory of the nights spent at Mass General, watching helplessly while his patient died.
The idea of a heart-lung machine, which had come to him, haunted him, and he asked Dr. Churchill to let him come back to Boston as a surgical fellow again and begin work on the heart-lung machine. He didn't get any encouragement to do this. Churchill himself wasn't very enthusiastic about it because he didn't think he'd get anywhere.
With only the smallest living stipend and no research grant, Gibbon was left to his own devices.
He got hoses and plugs from hardware stores. It wasn't done in a pristine, shiny, chromium-plated laboratory. A lot of it was done at home.
With Maylie's help, Gibbon constructed their first crude pump. But when it came time to begin testing it, they had a problem. They needed subjects.
He and his wife would do these studies originally in cats. Cats seemed to be available, especially in the back alleys of Boston, where they went out and hunted them down and collected them for their studies.
In 1935, after many failures, Gibbon succeeded in stopping a cat's heart while keeping it alive on the pump for several minutes.
Jack said that they were so overjoyed, he said they got up and danced around the laboratory.
Their celebration was extremely premature. Keeping a cat alive was one thing, but it would take 20 more years of grueling work before Gibbon had a pump that might be capable of supporting the life of an adult human. On May 6, 1953, 23 years after he'd first conceived it, Gibbon used the machine to operate on Cecilia Bevelek, an 18-year-old girl with a hole between two of the chambers of her heart.
And on that day, he operated upon her. There was no big audience. There was a snapshot of the operation, but it turned out well. He was able to close the hole, and the patient made a very good recovery. And essentially then she had a normal heart.
With his successful surgery on Cecilia Bevelek, John Gibbon had proven to himself and to the world that his heart-lung machine worked. And with it, he had literally given birth to the new field of open-heart surgery. Which brings us back to Jim Snow. Traditionally, a heart operation like his would have required a lengthy hospital stay, but not today. Amazingly, only 3 days after his surgery, Dr. Snow was able to walk out of the hospital with a healthy heart and only a small scar on the side of his chest to remind him that it happened at all.
Dr. Snow's recovery is, of course, a testament to his surgeon's skill, but it is only because of the courage, brilliance, and sometimes even mad obsession of history's medical mavericks that we've begun to understand the complexities of the human heart, and that we can fix it when it fails. For the History Channel, I'm Noah Wiley. Modern medicine can cure illness and repair damage in ways that were inconceivable even a few decades ago. But sometimes the damage to a heart, lung, or kidney is so severe that it is literally unsalvageable. That's when they turn to the last tool in medicine's arsenal, transplant. Hi, I'm Noah Wiley, and this is Mavericks, Miracles in Medicine, the stories of risk-takers and rebels who made some of history's greatest medical discoveries. We begin our program with Ken Whalen, a man whose life is threatened by his failing liver. And through his story, we'll meet some of the people behind the hard-won medical advances that have made Ken's survival possible.
Ken Whalen is a building supervisor at a public elementary school. He's 47 years old. But he's here because of an illness he contracted almost 40 years ago.
It was traced to when I was about 7, 8 years old. I had a severed leg.
Ken's childhood injury, sustained when a shovel cut through his leg, required that he have numerous surgeries and dozens of blood transfusions.
And back then, 35 to 40 years ago, a lot of the blood supply was tainted and bad.
From his many transfusions, Ken contracted a virus called hepatitis C, which over the years has quietly, persistently destroyed his liver, leaving him gravely ill.
Try not to move for about 10 seconds or so.
There's no cure for Ken's diseased liver. His only hope is to get a new liver before the one he has completely ceases to function.
I feel a quick pinch.
Now, we take it on faith that our doctors know how each organ in our bodies functions, that our livers process nutrients in our food and cleanse toxins from our blood, that our brains are the central processors for the nervous system, or that our blood moves around our bodies through veins and arteries propelled by the beating of our hearts. Now imagine doctors trying to practice medicine with an almost totally inaccurate knowledge of how a human body functions. Until the early 1600s, that's exactly what they did. And when a young Englishman named William Harvey dared to point it out, he was branded as a heretic. Harvey came to the University of Padua to finish his medical studies at the tail end of the Renaissance, a time of great artistic, scientific, and medical exploration.
We get William Harvey, who comes down from England, and if you visit the University of Padua, you can see up in the ceiling of the balconies and walkways that surround the school the insignias of the groups of students from the different countries. And when you have all of these people with different kinds of ideas, fertilizing, cross-fertilizing each other's minds, you're bound to come up with great things.
And slowly, some of the ancient misconceptions about the human body were being dispelled. It was here, after all, less than a century before, that the wonders of human anatomy had first been laid bare. But when it came to how the body actually worked, the greatest minds of science were still unwilling to challenge the theories of a 2nd century Greek physician known as Galen.
Galen was a Greek physician living in Rome in the 2nd century AD, a great systematizer of medical knowledge at the time, an incredibly prolific author, the author of some 120 texts, many of which survived and were responsible for his remarkable staying power, if you will.
During the Roman Empire and during the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, authority was the most important factor in anyone's notions of how the world went. If a great figure said, "This is the way it is," then this is the way it is. Now, Galen was the most powerful medical figure of his time.
The problem was Galen got a lot wrong. For example, when it came to the circulation of the blood, Galen believed that it didn't. His theory was that the blood flowed from the liver, where he believed it was made, out to the extremities, where somehow it disappeared. And as wrong as it was, his theory had gone unchallenged for over 1,000 years. Now Harvey comes along and says, this just doesn't add up. If Galen is right, then the average human would have to produce some 400 gallons of blood per day.
And he couldn't understand how the liver could make so much blood. It was just a simple hunk of curiosity that an ordinary man might have wondered about. It just happened that a brilliant physician was wondering about it.
After finishing his studies in Padua, Harvey returned to his native England, still obsessed with reconciling Galen's theories about the blood with his own observations. He was driven to embark upon an unprecedented series of experiments.
William Harvey's work was predicated on an extensive amount of animal experimentation. More than 80 species of mammal, of birds, of reptiles.
He was absolutely brutal. He was undoubtedly a very cold-hearted person. Yes, he did these vivisections of live pigs and dogs, and in fact they were chained down with chains on the dissecting tables and were screaming and shrieking as he did these dissections, and blood was spurting everywhere.
And he was particularly interested in the amount of blood that were contained in bodies, how much blood would course out of the body sort of in timed intervals.
The way that he obtained his knowledge was absolutely horrendous. But the way he obtained his knowledge also enabled him to make some of his great discoveries.
And what had Harvey discovered? The simple fact that the heart was a pump, which caused the blood to circulate throughout the body. And what is so obvious to us now was so heretical then that he feared revealing it. He was later to write,
I'm about to introduce a concept that is so novel that I fear not only for my life because of the envy of a few, but I'm terrified lest I have humanity at large as my enemies.
Harvey was very aware that his ideas wouldn't be well received, but he was as shrewd and ambitious as he was brilliant, and he had a plan.
He married Elizabeth Brown, and she was the daughter of a Dr. Brown who was Queen Elizabeth's physician. And this gained him immediate acceptance in the Royal College of Physicians of London.
In 1616, he's very much engrossed in this work that will eventually sort of topple Galenic ideas about the body. But by 1618, he's one of the king's physicians. He was on a fast track to prestige in English circles.
What he decided to do was very clever indeed, and that was for 12 years he did vivisections of animals in front of the members of the Royal College of Physicians of London, so they could see exactly what he was doing and he could gain their confidence.
It was only in 1628, many years after beginning his research into the circulation of the blood, that Harvey finally felt secure enough to publish his findings in a groundbreaking work known as De Motu Cordis, on the action of the heart.
In the 17th century, 3 of the greatest books in the English language were published. The first was the King James Version of the Bible. The next was the folio edition of Shakespeare's works. And the third was, in fact, William Harvey's book on the circulation of the blood.
But Harvey's peers didn't see it that way. Some of the most prominent physicians of the day published full-length volumes decrying his claim that the blood circulated throughout the body.
This work, De Motu Cordis, represents among the most profound challenges to Galenic physiology that one might possibly envision. The kind of challenge from which Galen is never going to recover.
Although not in Harvey's lifetime, eventually his theory forced the entire medical profession to rethink what it knew about the functioning of the human body, and it earned him his place in history as the father of modern physiology.
When we return, if Ken has surgery, he'll need blood, and lots of it. We'll meet the man whose gruesome 17th century experiments paved the way for human blood transfusion.
In the 1960s, Ken Whalen got hepatitis C from a tainted blood transfusion during surgery to repair his leg. At the time, blood banking was still a young and inexact science. But when Ken goes in for transplant surgery, it will be a totally different story. Before he receives a drop of donated blood, a veritable army of people and technology will have put it through an exhaustive series of tests, screening it for contaminants and viruses, typing, matching, storing, and delivering it in a precise and highly regulated process. But how this now common practice began is one of the more bizarre chapters in the history of medicine. Human blood transfusion had its roots in 17th century Paris, born amid scientific missteps, personal vendetta, and scandal. And the man at the center of it all was a physician named Jean-Baptiste Denis. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that in the summer of 1667, Denis was doing very well. He held the vaunted position of physician to Louis XIV, and he was, not surprisingly, the envy of his peers. And all might have remained as it was, if not for Denis' niggling obsession with the idea of transfusing blood and his chance encounter with a madman.
Denis is working in his lab, and in the middle of the night, his friend and colleague, the Count de Montmorency, comes in with a madman in tow. The madman's name is Antoine Maury. He lived somewhere in the suburbs of Paris, and he suffered what they called frenzies, during which he would batter his wife, strip off all his clothes, and run through the town setting house fires along the way. Clearly somebody you want off the street. So when confronted with this person, then he thought, what can I do? And he thought, a calf.
The idea being that the blood of a tranquil, sedate creature would have a calming effect on this man who had suffered these fits or frenzies and would act out in a variety of ways.
To any modern person, the idea of putting animal blood into a human being would be nothing short of barbaric. But in the context of 17th century beliefs, it made perfect sense, particularly their belief in something called vitalism.
Vitalism was this belief that the blood kind of represents everything that your species represents, so it carried the characteristics of it. So the blood of a lion would be somehow brave and ferocious. The blood of a sheep would be timid. The blood of a calf would be meek. And this theory said the blood had those characteristics. So this was the whole environment in which the first experiments with transfusion took place.
For several months now, Denis had been experimenting with transfusing the blood of animals into human beings, and by some miracle, his patients had survived. In fact, he believed they were actually being cured. So proud was he of these first experiments that he had published the results in the famous Journal of the Royal Society of London.
Denis was an extraordinarily ambitious physician, and the court of Louis XIV was a place for extraordinary ambition, extraordinary resentment, extraordinary backbiting, and it seems clear that Denis' efforts to publicize his new therapy angered and enraged his contemporaries.
The French Academy, terribly jealous about what he was doing, began publishing pamphlets and tracts decrying him. They called transfusion a monster technology. They likened it to cannibalism. They said it was sinful. One said it was technology directly from Satan's boutique.
Despite the firestorm of criticism, Denis was committed to continuing his work. He had no notion that the madman who'd been brought to him tonight would prove to be his undoing.
So he set him down, opened up a vein of the patient and artery of the calf, connected them, and put in a few ounces of blood. The patient felt a strange reaction, a feeling of heat rising up his arm, but then he calmed down. And to Denis, this was a success. The madman calmed down. 2 days later, he tries it again.
His second effort did not do very well at all. The man began to experience extreme distress as the blood from the animal was flowing into him.
Same procedure, same animal, same patient. Feels the heat rising up his arm, begins to vomit, gets terribly feverish, starts urinating black, as though it had been mixed with coal ash, as Denis wrote. And everybody was quite worried.
Fortunately for both Denis and the patient, he did survive this encounter, but it was certainly a threat to the kind of success that Denis had envisioned, sort of the ongoing sort of success of this new therapy.
Understandably, Denis became very wary of going ahead with more transfusions to this patient.
And then the story gets a little murky. It's the patient's wife who comes to Denis and asks him to try the therapy one more time. This is something that Denis seems reluctant to do, first, not least, because he'd had such a bad experience the last time they had tried the therapy.
And he's thinking, I don't want anything to do with this guy. He is not long for this earth. She begs and begs, and he says no. So she goes home, and sometime later he gets a dispatch from his trusted assistant. Could he please come to Pauline Maury's house? She wants to apologize.
When he arrives, he finds the transfusion equipment's all set up. An animal is already there. And against his better judgment, he does undertake to perform the transfusion. Things go badly, and even before sort of the blood flow begins, the patient is in a state where Denis is determined not to continue, and it comes to a halt.
Denis was very perplexed when, the next day, he heard that his patient had died. And even more so by his next visit with Madame Moreau.
She goes to his house and says that his enemies have given her money and said that unless he financially supports her for life, she will publicly charge him with malpractice and murder.
But far from being intimidated, Denis responded by taking her to court to stop her from defaming him. What followed has to have been one of the strangest trials in medical history.
In the course of this slander suit against the patient's widow, it becomes clear that the patient did not die because of the transfusion effort. In fact, there had been no blood flow from the animal to the recipient. Instead, it becomes clear that the patient had been poisoned.
It turns out that Mrs. Moreau has not been entirely innocent. Slowly over the weeks, she's been slipping arsenic into her husband's soup.
Faced with this evidence, the court ruled in favor of Denis. Nonetheless, both he and science suffered a terrible loss that spring day in 1668.
The lieutenant of the court ruled that from now on, if anybody wants to do a transfusion in France, they have to clear it with the French Academy. In other words, with Denis' enemies, the most hidebound, tradition-bound, closed-minded group of physicians in France.
And that's the death knell for transfusion. Given the political infighting, the great criticism of Denis' efforts, there will be no more approval. There will be no approval for any future transfusions.
In short order, the French Parliament, the Roman government, and the English all outlawed transfusion, calling it illegal and criminal. And what of Madame Moreau?
In the end, we don't know what happened to Pauline Moreau. What we do know is that with this case, she set the science back 150 years.
Next, there are no drugs that will help Ken, so the hunt is on for a donor to replace his failing liver. And we'll hear the tragic story of the eccentric 19th century scientist who gave the world its first real drug.
The reason Ken Whalen is here now is that for all the years that hepatitis was destroying his liver, there were no drugs that could stop it. And though there now is a drug for hepatitis C, when Ken needed it, it wasn't there. Now imagine that for any of us, for any diseases, there were no drugs, period. No penicillin, no Tylenol, nothing. Well, for most of medical history, physicians had little more to work with than folk cures and potions. The sick were starved, purged, frozen, bled, and even electrocuted. Not surprisingly, these treatments rarely helped and often did serious harm. So one would expect that when in 1909 a brilliant eccentric German scientist named Paul Ehrlich finally gave the world its first real drug, that he would have been hailed as a national hero. Instead, what followed became one of the more tragic cautionary tales in medical history.
Paul Ehrlich probably came on exactly the right time in the 1800s because there was a ferment in biology, there was a ferment in medicine, there was a development of pathology, the understanding of how diseases work. There were developments in medicine like the germ theory due to Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. It was nothing short of fantastic.
But although they finally understood that germs caused diseases, even the greatest scientific minds of the day were clueless as to how to treat them. The belief was that any chemical which could kill a germ would also kill the patient. The one dissenting voice in this chorus of naysayers was Ehrlich's.
Ehrlich was the first one who developed the notion that you could develop a drug, a chemical, that would be so specific, acting against the bacterium, that it would kill the bacterium while sparing the diseased person. He called this a magic bullet.
Ehrlich was undaunted by the skepticism of his colleagues. Already a Nobel Prize winner for his work on vaccines, he was now convinced that he could create just such a substance.
Paul Ehrlich and his Japanese assistant Hata tested many, many compounds. Finally, after 605 attempts with different compounds, varying all sorts of things, they found compound 606, ultimately named salvarsan, which worked perfectly in their experimental animals.
A derivative of the poison arsenic, salvarsan proved capable of destroying one of the most widespread scourges of the day, syphilis.
As long as people were having sex, there was syphilis, and everyone's, of course, blamed it on everybody else. You know, the French call it the Neapolitan disease, and the Neapolitans call it the French disease, but it didn't really have anything to combat it until the arsenical salvarsan was discovered.
Syphilis had been one of the most feared of infectious diseases. Now Ehrlich had discovered a cure which promised to save millions of lives. So this extraordinary triumph should have been the crowning achievement of an already stellar career. But virtually as soon as salvarsan was released, Ehrlich came under attack from all quarters. Leading the charge were those who had profited from the many quack cures that existed for syphilis.
Well, any time that somebody introduces a drug that really works well, he's going to step on somebody's toes. People who are using quack remedies where the profit therefrom is going to be threatened objected, saying salvarsan is a dangerous drug.
Ehrlich ignored those attacks, but they were only the beginning. Although he had issued careful instructions on the safe use of salvarsan, many doctors ignored them, and patients were dying. The doctors blamed Ehrlich for those deaths.
You know, arsenic is a poison, and if it's administered wrong, you can get a lot of damage, and people died from getting salvarsan in the improper dosage.
One of the problems was that it was a powder. It had to be mixed with water, and it had to be injected. If the water was bad, if the needle was contaminated, then there would be a bad side effect. The other point was that people expected salvarsan to cure syphilis at every stage, and salvarsan was only good during the early stages of syphilis. So if people tried to treat late-stage syphilis and didn't have success, they argued that salvarsan was useless.
Ehrlich became more and more disturbed by these unjust and escalating attacks.
People who opposed Ehrlich and who opposed salvarsan would grab any straw to fight against them. And one of the straws they grabbed was to accuse Ehrlich and the drug company of making too much profit. It turned out not to be true, but for a time they used this and said they're making it for a few marks and they're selling it for a lot of marks, and therefore they're fleecing, and Ehrlich is getting rich.
Ehrlich was attacked from all directions, with accusations that he hadn't really discovered salvarsan, claims that he hadn't properly tested it, and even allegations that a major hospital was forcing prostitutes to use the drug against their will. Tired and angry, Ehrlich finally vented his rage at the whole mess in a letter to a local newspaper. He wrote, "Naturopaths, anti-injectionists, quacks, anti-vivisectionists, and anti-Semites have all banded together to blacken my name and weave a veritable web of the most absolute and glaring lies." It's ironic that Ehrlich had ushered in an age of medical miracles and at the same time opened the Pandora's box of commercialism and politics that attend medical discovery even today. And sadly, he didn't live long enough to enjoy the place he would come to hold in medical history as the father of drug therapy.
I think that Paul Ehrlich's last years could not have been very happy, and he probably prematurely aged as a result. He looked like he was 100 years old on the day he died at age 61.
When we next see Ken Whalen, we'll meet the young woman who will try to save his life, and the remarkable surgeon who 50 years ago first made the dream of organ transplantation a reality.
With over 17,000 patients waiting for a donor liver, and with his liver almost dead, Ken's time is running out. But Ken is one of the lucky ones. They found a compatible donor, his 21-year-old daughter, Jessica. Lou Tepperman is the transplant surgeon.
We remember that your papa's liver looks like this. This is the cirrhosis. And what we're planning to do is to take out the right lobe of the liver, take out your dad's whole liver, then we're going to take your right lobe, give it to Papa, and that's going to grow him a whole new liver in about 6 months. And your left lobe, it's going to grow you a whole new liver.
It's very fortunate for Ken that he has a daughter who wants to help him, and fortunate that he lives in a time when this complex surgery is even possible. But it isn't without risks.
If you remember the numbers, what did I say the chances are that you could die?
1%, but
right. Why do you want to do this?
If the situation were reversed, I know he'd do the same. It's not really a choice for me. It's something that I know I need to do, basically.
It's out of love.
For hundreds of years, men of medicine had dreamt of replacing failed body parts with new ones. But though it seemed logical that one could, all the early attempts at transplantation failed. The problem was the immune system. What nobody understood was that each body was capable of distinguishing other people's parts from its own, and when it sensed an invader, of destroying it. So while by the 1940s, surgeons had figured out the mechanics of transplanting an organ, the problem of immune rejection had proven an insurmountable roadblock. Then Richard and Ronald Herrick came along and offered medicine a 1 in a million opportunity.
I got out of the Army in, I think it was the 3rd of November in 1953. And he was supposed to get out of the Coast Guard. When they gave him his physical for discharge, they found his blood pressure was high.
This turned out to be symptomatic of a much more serious problem. Richard's kidneys were failing.
Richard, when it was discovered that he had nephritis, he was transferred to Boston. The first time I saw him, he'd lost a lot of weight, and he was just in bad condition overall.
A doctor in the public health hospital here in Boston recognized that the boy was dying and had read in the newspapers about the Brigham program.
In 1953, Joseph Murray was a surgeon at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital and part of a small team of doctors who were exploring the new and, so far, highly speculative field of kidney transplantation.
In general, the medical establishment in the 1950s considered that the transplantation of tissues and organs from one person to an unrelated other person was going to be impossible.
A well-meaning faculty member of the medical school at the Brigham kind of took a shine to me. And he just said, don't get involved in it. It's a waste of your time. It'll ruin your career.
But Murray ignored that advice and began doing experimental kidney transplants on animals and on a few dying patients. Sometimes they worked for a week or so, but always in the end, the patients died.
We knew that it was an immunological problem, incompatibility between individuals, but we also knew from work done by plastic surgeons in the Middle West that identical twins had no problem in accepting skin grafts.
And if they could accept skin grafts, maybe they could accept a kidney. Together, the 21-year-old Herrick brothers and Dr. Murray were going to find out.
We knew they were twins, but we wanted to be sure that they were immunologically identical.
They took his skin and put it on my arm and my skin on his arm to see if it would stay on there, if it was compatible.
I called the police down at the local station and told them what we were going to do, and could they do some fingerprinting, because the fingerprints had to be within a certain pattern of similarity. And that was funny, because on the way home, I turned the radio on, and I got the news that the Brigham doctors are planning a daring operation.
As it turned out, the twins were genetically identical. Now, Ronald had a very difficult decision to make.
They left it up to me to decide, because I was the one who was going to do it. And they weren't going to make the decision for me.
After Ronald was told that there was a possibility of a transplant, he just said, I felt a real conflict of emotions. Of course I wanted to help my brother, but the only operation I'd have had was an appendectomy, and I hadn't much liked that.
And Richard wasn't much happier about the whole thing.
He just said, go home, don't do it.
But Ronald dismissed his brother's warning, and 2 days before Christmas, 1954, they went ahead with the historic kidney transplant.
There were 2 operations in adjacent operating rooms, and Dr. Harrison, the urological surgeon, was responsible for the donor operation.
I didn't see Dr. Harrison there yet. So I kept asking, where's Dr. Harrison? He's the one who's supposed to do this, because the intern was standing there. And I said to myself, I don't want the intern doing this. I want the guy who knows what he's doing, you know.
The transplantation of a kidney, or in fact of any organ, involves a lot of very, very fine microsurgery connecting the blood vessels. And therefore, it was technically a very difficult event.
It was a little, not frightening, but it was a responsibility, because it's the only kidney in the whole universe that was compatible. And I didn't want to goof it up for a technical reason.
Luckily for all concerned, Dr. Murray's work was flawless.
When we released the clamps, the kidney became engorged with blood, and it actually bled from the surface, little pinpoint bleeders, as you'd expect a normal kidney to do. And we felt that we were on the road.
I think that the success of that first kidney transplant with these kids, one of whom had been terribly sick, coming out looking perfectly healthy, was very important for the public and very important for science, because it showed that the transplantation of an organ would work.
Ronald's kidney brought his brother back to life. Richard ended up marrying his nurse, and they had 2 daughters. But after 8 years, his new kidney succumbed to the same infection that had caused his illness in the first place. Nonetheless, the Herrick twins had opened the door to the field of organ transplantation, and for his achievement, Dr. Joseph Murray was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine.
When we return, Ken's operation. It'll take 2 surgical teams, 2 operating rooms, and 13 hours. And we'll meet the Scottish scientist whose controversial experiments might one day make all of that unnecessary.
This morning, Jessica Whalen is going to be a hero. Although she'll be asleep in a few minutes, she's about to save her father's life. 2 full surgical teams in adjoining rooms will take more than 12 hours to perform what's called a live donor liver transplant, all choreographed by Jessica's surgeon, Lou Tepperman.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's rock and roll.
Dr. Tepperman has to expose Jessica's entire abdomen to give him access to her liver. It takes more than 3 hours, cutting millimeter by millimeter, to separate the half of Jessica's liver that she'll keep from the half she'll give to her dad.
And this is the piece that we're going to give to him, and it's a bigger piece.
As Tepperman's team works in one room, Ken is prepped for his surgery in the other. The timing is critical. In his own small ritual, Dr. Tepperman always carries the liver himself between the 2 operating rooms. Finally, Dr. Tepperman removes Ken's diseased liver. And almost 12 hours after this harrowing process began, it's over. Ken Whalen now has a fighting chance at a new life because his daughter Jessica insisted on taking the very real risk of this grueling surgery. But what if she didn't have to?
If you can go to people and say, I don't have to transplant your liver, I'm going to transplant cells. If you can go to somebody and say, I don't have to try and repair your Parkinsonism with drugs, I'm going to put something in your head that's going to make the same substance that you can't make anymore. If I can make your life longer and better with less intervention, with less burden on you, why wouldn't we want to do that?
In fact, ever since Watson and Crick revolutionized the field of genetics by describing the structure of DNA, scientists had dreamt that it might be possible to grow new organs or body parts. The problem was it would require a technology that seemed outside the realm of scientific possibility. Then, in February of 1997, all that changed. The news came out that a scientist named Ian Wilmot, working in a small Scottish farming town, had succeeded in cloning a sheep.
It was a Sunday, and the story leaked. And the New York Times had something, and a Scottish newspaper had something, and the story leaked that an animal had been cloned.
The reaction was sheer, unabated, ridiculous, crazy frenzy.
And why all this insanity over a sheep?
I mean, sheep are sheep. They're very dull, they're not particularly smart animals, they bleat. And in Dolly's case, she doesn't even move around very much, and she is, in fact, kind of a dull-looking sheep, but one who happened to, in many respects, have changed history.
What was so special about Dolly was that she represented the first successful attempt ever to clone an animal from adult cells, and this was seen as having tremendous possibilities for curing disease.
There's clearly the potential that through cloning, you could grow tissues, you could grow cells, or you could grow organs that were almost your exact genetic match, if not close to being your genetic match.
But when Dolly was announced, the focus wasn't on possible medical applications. Her birth immediately elicited the fear that if you could clone an adult animal, then maybe cloning a human being wasn't far behind.
When Dolly appeared, and you said you'd cloned something, all of that maelstrom of worry and concern about where's all this genetics taking us gets unleashed.
And that wasn't so surprising, given the perceptions of cloning before Dolly was born.
Cloning actually had a history. It just didn't have a history that was in reality.
Well, if you look at science fiction, what always got cloned was either something evil, like Hitler, or something that when it was cloned would be scary.
If you looked at one of the most popular set of movies in world history, Jurassic Park, they're cloning movies. Aldous Huxley and the Brave New World, The Boys from Brazil, lots and lots of other presentations in fiction and cinema.
And cloning wasn't entirely science fiction. Ever since the 1950s, there were cloning experiments being done, but nobody had paid them any attention.
People forget that when some experiments were done on tadpoles and frogs, most of the media yawned, most of the scientific community didn't care.
And at first, no one was paying much attention to Ian Wilmot either.
Ian Wilmot is an unprepossessing-looking scientist. He's a family guy. He has 3 grown children. His wife is an elder in the local church. He is just a very dedicated, sober-minded scientist.
Wilmot was an agricultural researcher employed at the Roslin Institute in a small Scottish farming town with some 1,800 inhabitants. He was about as far as one could be from the scientific mainstream.
There wasn't a whole lot going on in Roslin at all. There were a lot of sheep, probably more sheep in the immediate environs of Roslin than people.
And far from being the stuff of horror movies, Wilmot's work was quite mundane. For most of his 2 decades at Roslin, his mission consisted of trying to create farm animals that would produce more meat, softer wool, or better milk. And it was this work that moved him to explore the science of cloning.
In fact, Wilmot said from the start, first of all, that his goal was nothing remotely related to cloning human beings. He was really interested in creating better animals and possibly creating animals that could be factories for human drugs.
Finally, in July of 1996, after hundreds of tries, Wilmot succeeded in cloning a lamb from the cells of an adult sheep.
He's got a slight wicked sense of humor. After all, he decided to name the sheep Dolly after Dolly Parton because the adult cell that he had taken the nuclear material from was from a mammary gland of a sheep, and he pointed out that Dolly Parton had well-known mammaries.
Wilmot published the results of his work in the journal Nature under the very unsexy title, Viable Offspring Derived from Fetal and Adult Mammalian Cells. The word cloning didn't even appear in the article. But when word of Dolly leaked out to the mainstream press, it was total mayhem.
All hell broke loose. Journalists from all corners of the globe descended upon the Institute. Dolly was invited to appear on a talk show in the United States on television. Wilmot and his colleagues gave hundreds of interviews on television, radio, and to print entities around the globe.
There were serious concerns about the ethical implications of Dolly's birth.
I remember what the reactions were because I also started to get phone calls very fast, and I mean hundreds of phone calls. The biggest set of responses coming in on ethics questions that I'd ever lived through. And they came from news organizations, and they came from the National Enquirer. I mean, they came from everywhere.
And it wasn't just the media that was concerned.
President Clinton, who was president at the time, had just impaneled the Bioethics Commission. He ordered the Bioethics Commission to immediately consider the implications of human cloning, and in light of the fact that Dolly had been created. And in fact, when Wilmot was on a trip to the United States to attend another scientific conference, he was summoned to testify before the U.S. Congress about what he had done.
I think that sadly, people are not thinking through carefully some of the suggested applications for copying a person.
Wilmot found himself in the position time and time again of having to explain his views on the cloning of human beings.
We would share the concern that this technique should not be misused. As you know, this is a collaborative project between a company and ourselves, and none of us would consider applying this technique in any way in human beings. We can see no reason why you would want to copy an adult human being, and it is in fact already illegal in this country to do this kind of experimentation.
Probably more than 50 countries around the world now either outlaw human cloning altogether or put serious constraints on all forms of cloning, including cloning of cells.
Clearly, however benign the intentions might have been to mass-produce better farm animals or to create organs for human transplant, the possibilities created by Dolly's birth have raised fears and concerns not unlike those raised by the discovery of atomic energy in the last century.
The phenomenon of Dolly became the atomic bomb equivalent for the age of biology. Dolly isn't the last word on this subject, but she was the start of what is going to be a major philosophical, theological, literary, artistic exploration in the 21st century.
Whatever the future may bring, for now, a transplant from his courageous daughter was Ken Whalen's only hope. With it, Ken will return this fall to his old job. And remarkably, in only a month, Jessica's liver has completely regenerated, and she'll soon return to college and to her great love, playing softball.
Watching the miracle of Ken Whalen's transplant surgery, it's easy to forget the centuries of medical discovery at work in that operating room. But without the pioneers who throughout history took insane risks, flaunted conventional wisdom, and suffered their colleagues' scorn, we wouldn't have been able to save Ken's life today. For the History Channel, I'm Noah Wiley. The human brain. It's been studied by scientists for more than 2,000 years, yet it remains the most mysterious region of the body. When it's working properly, it goes virtually unnoticed. When it isn't, it can wreak unimaginable havoc. Hi, I'm Noah Wiley, and this is Mavericks, Miracles in Medicine, the stories of people who made some of medicine's greatest discoveries, people who challenged conventional wisdom, and who, more often than not, were ridiculed or even reviled in their own time. Our program begins with the case of Jim Corella, a man whose brain betrays him almost daily. Through his story, we'll discover some of the incredible breakthroughs in medical history that have made it possible for Jim's doctors to understand and hopefully treat his illness.
Jim Corella is 40 years old. He's married, he works as a paralegal, and he's had epilepsy for more than half his life. This is his world.
I've had seizures and fallen down the steps at the post office, waiting in line to vote. I've fallen on subway platforms. I've fallen on subway tracks.
Because his seizures come without warning, Jim can't drive a car, he can't walk the dog, and he's afraid to have children. He's had too many injuries to recount.
Concussion, broken nose, cracked orbitals, lacerations, separated shoulders, dislocated fingers, cracked ribs.
In fact, just yesterday, Jim fractured his eye socket falling down the stairs. But in addition to his physical injuries, Jim suffers from people's ignorance about his disease.
Even the professionals, like the police, automatically make assumptions. I'm either someone who drinks, someone who does drugs, a vagrant. There's still that underlying concept of ignorance against people who have a physical malady that other people don't understand.
Although Jim and others with epilepsy still suffer the prejudices of an unsophisticated public, we've at least progressed to the point where medicine treats his disease as a physical disorder. But for much of history, people like Jim were perceived as having maladies of the soul rather than of the body or the mind.
In the Middle Ages, Malleus Maleficorum, the witch-hunting manual authorized by papal authority, said that one of the ways you can identify a witch was by the presence of seizures, and that witches can cause seizures, and that forever people with epilepsy were considered to have a curse of the gods, were to be possessed.
Epilepsy was a disorder associated with devils, with Satanism. It was a disorder which in many parts of the world, people with epilepsy were being burned at the stake. They were being burned as heretics.
Everything that can be done was done to people with epilepsy. Everything from opiates to marijuana to bleeding and leeches, exorcism, religious ceremonies, everything imaginable.
It's ironic that a man of the deepest religious convictions, an Englishman named Thomas Willis, would be the one to wrest epilepsy from the grip of the spiritual world and move it into the realm of science.
Willis was the predominant figure of 17th century neurology. He gave neurology its name and really was both a master clinician and was the senior neurologist in England during that time.
As a young man, Willis had gone to Oxford University to pursue a career not in science, but in the church. And though ultimately he was drawn to the healing arts instead, he would face his greatest challenge attempting to reconcile these two worlds.
He received his doctorate of medicine, and then he received an appointment to lecture in the tradition of Aristotle at Oxford. And he interpreted the tradition of Aristotle as somebody who did a lot of observing and a lot of dissection.
Willis dissected the whole brain and viewed it not just from the bottom up, but from the top down and from the sides, which gave him the first true full view of the brain.
But the more Willis explored, the more he found himself treading on what was considered sacred territory. It had long been believed that the brain was the home of the soul, but what Willis found was of a much more earthly nature. Disorders like epilepsy, which were attributed to maladies of the spirit, seem to have inescapable correlations to physical injuries or illnesses.
Willis said, no, this is a naturally occurring disease. It's a brain disease, and it should be treated and it should be understood by medical men.
Willis's pronouncement was based on his own experimental observations, but it had its roots in ancient history.
In 500 BC, Hippocrates, in the Sacred Disease, his monograph on epilepsy, said that epilepsy is not a curse of the gods. Epilepsy does not carry with it any prophetic powers. Epilepsy is a natural disease of the brain. Somehow, that incredibly prescient vision was lost for essentially more than 2,000 years.
Now, in the mid-1600s, Willis was faced with the inescapable rightness of Hippocrates' ancient theory. But his revelation left the pious Willis with a terrible dilemma. As a religious man, he was loath to reject the church's view, but as a scientist, he couldn't ignore what he was seeing.
Such things were lurking in the minds of learned individuals for a long time, but no one was brave enough to go against church, to go against the framework that everyone else was embedded in.
Now, the question is, how can you study some of the things or do some of the things that Willis was doing and appease the church?
Willis agonized over his dilemma. He was no rebel and certainly didn't want to be viewed as a heretic. Finally, after much reflection, he hit upon an answer. There must be more than one soul. An immortal soul, which was completely the purview of the church, and what he called a body soul, which, he argued, dies with us and governs our basic mental and neurological functions. But would the church accept this revolutionary notion?
One of his closest friends was a man by the name of Gilbert Shelton, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Willis was not about to pull out the rug from under the church. With his concept of a body soul as opposed to an immortal soul, he made his approach acceptable to Shelton, and he did not incur any problems with the church.
That the brain, and particularly its disorders, were moved into the realm of medicine changed everything.
This was a big jump because it allowed people like Thomas Willis, to say disorders of memory or disorders of intellect. These are now, in fact, body functions, not just functions of the immortal soul. And we can now study the brain, and this does not have to be the domain of the clergy.
Over the next few years, Willis published what would become the formative works in the field of neurology, including his crowning achievement, Cerebri Anatomae, the anatomy of the brain.
In 1664, the publication of Cerebri Anatomae was really the land-breaking event in human brain dissection and understanding. I think it was left for someone like Willis to picture the brain, which he did with Christopher Wren. The most amazing copper plates, the most amazing renderings of the human brain done at that time.
Cerebri Anatomae is considered to be largely responsible for establishing neurology as a science, which made Willis's dedication of the work particularly ironic. Prominently displayed across from the title page is the very unscientific inscription, "In honor of Christ the Father and Lord God and His divine providence, Gilbert Shelton, the Archbishop of Canterbury."
When we next see Jim Carella, we'll be looking literally inside his brain. And we'll meet the unlikely hero whose accidental discovery first made it possible to see inside a living human body.
Jim Carella takes 4 separate medications every day in an attempt to control his epilepsy.
When was your last seizure?
It's probably about 2:30.
Today?
Yes.
But the medication isn't working, and his doctors are contemplating more aggressive treatment.
Close your eyes. Open your eyes.
And in order to choose a course of treatment, they need to take a closer look at the landscape of Jim's brain. The EEG permits them to literally see his brain's electrical function. Then a brain MRI creates a three-dimensional image permitting them to see any structural abnormalities, like a lesion or a tumor. And with this technology, Jim's doctors can look literally millimeter by millimeter inside Jim's brain. But for most of medical history, the only time doctors could visualize the inside of a patient's brain was after he was dead. Then, in one of the most fortuitous accidents in the history of medicine, a window was opened into the inner world of the body. It was 1895. Only a few years before, Thomas Edison had made the first practical light bulb. Now, understanding how electricity behaves had become the passion of many of the leading physicists of the day. It was also consuming the imagination of an obscure academic named Wilhelm Röntgen.
Röntgen was a model of 19th century European, German scientist, a physicist, an experimentalist, in some ways a philosopher whose philosophy was expressed through scientific experimentation.
By the age of 50, Röntgen had taught at 4 different universities, and he'd published some 48 papers, all without achieving the slightest notoriety. Now, in his laboratory at the University of Würzburg, all that was about to change.
So he's in his basement. He's working on his Crookes tube, which is something that looks like a light bulb with a positive and a negative terminal, and he passes electricity through it.
Röntgen was electrifying this oddly shaped glass vacuum tube to produce what are known as cathode rays. It was known that these mysterious rays could travel a very short distance outside the tube, and Röntgen was curious about this phenomenon. Now, on the evening of November 8, 1895, he was conducting a simple experiment to see if the rays would penetrate the tube, even if it was completely blacked out.
He covered it carefully with all this dark cardboard, turned out the lights of the room so they were pitch dark to try and see whether or not these electrons would come through. And in the pitch dark, while he was doing this, all of a sudden, about a yard away from him, he saw something glowing.
What was glowing was a piece of cardboard coated with a fluorescent material sitting on a table several feet from the tube.
And he realizes that there's a correlation when the electrical current is passing through this vacuum tube with electricity, the glow occurs, and something has to be emanating through the cardboard.
And he knew that electrons couldn't travel that distance. It was an absolute known fact.
And there were no known rays or particles at that time to account for this.
Röntgen was baffled. What strange form of energy had he unleashed that could pass through glass, cardboard, and several feet of air? He called these mysterious rays X-rays.
So once he makes this extraordinary discovery, he wanted to find out what these X-rays would pass through and what they wouldn't pass through.
Over the next few weeks, he tried numerous different materials to see if they would block the mysterious rays. He started with a pack of playing cards.
It could go through wood, it could go through paper. He took a 2-inch thick book. It still glowed.
Finally, he had a box with lead in it and tested it. And finally, it appeared the lead would be the substance that the X-ray could not pass through.
About this, Röntgen would write, "What sort of wave or ray is doing what I see this one doing? Am I making some sort of mistake? Or am I possibly going mad?"
He decided that in order to prove he wasn't mad, he was going to get his wife to come down to see what he was doing.
With great fanfare, he sat his wife Bertha down, placed her hand on a photographic plate, and turned on the X-ray tube. She sat motionless during the exposure, and then waited with anxious anticipation as he developed the plate.
And she sees her hand. She sees the bones, she sees the wedding band, and she is at first frightened by the photograph.
She said, "Oh my God, I'm looking at my own bones." She said, "I'm looking at my own death." She was absolutely terrified at this, and he was delighted because now he'd proved for himself unequivocally that he wasn't going mad. what he was doing was actually happening.
Röntgen was aware that this was something extraordinary. And in only a few short weeks, he managed to write and submit an article detailing his experiments to a scientific journal. The editor at first expressed little interest in Röntgen's work, but when he saw the X-ray of Bertha's hand, he published the paper immediately. Meanwhile, the story was picked up by one of Vienna's most popular newspapers, and in short order it received worldwide publicity. Within weeks, headlines screamed, "New light sees through flesh to bones," and public demonstrations of this strange new ray abounded.
One of the important things about Röntgen is that he was a physicist. And as a physicist, he was simply interested in the physics of this thing.
But apparently Röntgen was clueless as to the tremendous medical significance of his discovery. So he was baffled and even annoyed by all the attention.
And I think he never initially saw the relevance, the wide relevance of what he had discovered, although I think those around him quickly saw it in the medical community as well as the lay community, which is what led to this essentially worldwide overnight fame for the man.
Literally within months, doctors on both sides of the Atlantic began using the X-ray to look beneath their patient's skin. Meanwhile, the shy and humble Röntgen went back to his basement laboratory. He shunned the limelight, refused speaking engagements, and never patented nor profited from his discovery. Finally, in 1901, he was coaxed out into the limelight when he was given the first Nobel Prize ever awarded for physics. But even then, Röntgen remained true to form. All he could muster by way of an acceptance speech was 2 words: "Thank you."
When we continue, Jim's doctors will explore the functioning of his brain, and we'll meet the much maligned 18th century genius whose theories about the brain got him thrown out of his own country.
Five, 8, 7, 9, 6, 4.
5, 8, 7, 9, 6, 4.
Excellent.
Now that they've taken pictures of Jim's brain, his doctors need to know what effect Jim's epilepsy has had on the specific areas of his brain responsible for cognitive, intellectual, and motor functions.
I'm going to point to these blocks in a certain sequence, and I want you to point to the same blocks in the same sequence. There we go.
To find that out, Dr. William Barr, a neuropsychologist, is giving Jim a battery of tests.
What I want you to do is put all the pegs into the holes.
The theoretical basis of these tests is simple: that different parts of the brain are responsible for different functions. An area for memory, an area for speech, one for vision, and so on and so forth.
Just follow what I'm doing here.
What's remarkable is that the man responsible for originating this theory some 200 years ago was vilified by his peers as a crank and a charlatan, and was ultimately drummed out of his own country. His name was Franz Josef Gall.
The story's told that as a boy, Gall had a close friend who had a remarkable memory, and that boy had bulging eyes.
He thought that there was a correlation here, and the more he thought about it, the more convinced he was that large bulging eyes were a sign of an individual who was extremely skilled in verbal memorization.
Throughout his education and early career, Gall continued to obsess on his childhood observation that his young friend's memory was somehow associated with one area of his brain. And if this was so, Gall reasoned, other functions must have their own special areas as well.
And I think that in itself says a lot about Gall. He was an iconoclast. He was someone who wanted to see the world differently and act differently than the mainstream, and he did that very well.
The mainstream view of the brain at that time was that it was a single unified organ, and that all of its functions were performed by the whole brain. But Gall believed otherwise, and he was determined to prove it.
And what he did during the late 1700s, but also well into the 1800s, was go out and collect as many examples of individuals with unique talents and particular bumps on the skull, individuals lacking talents with depressions on the skull, as he could. And he worked in both directions, trying to correlate structure with function.
He was a very systematic and good collector of data. The problem was he was an enormously biased collector of data. He saw what he wanted to see, and as often happens in bad science, he did not see what he didn't want to see.
Where he got into trouble was explaining away cases that did not seem to fit the theory. In other words, if something was not quite right, he and his followers always had an explanation. They were always able to say, well, this doesn't count.
Using this methodology, which became known as phrenology, Gall came up with 26 different areas of the brain, which he actually believed were distinct organs, each responsible for one function or trait.
And the traits were remarkable ones, not just the ones we might today think about, memory, but also love of family, love of friends, mirth, spirituality, love of children. Things that, again, in today's world, we would not typically segregate as cortical qualities or behavioral traits that one would acquire.
To understand just how specific and crazy his research got, one need only look at the case study of a woman who had killed her child.
She was being held in a prison for the criminally insane. And Gall's data seemed to allow him to make the argument that this woman was not an ordinary criminal, that she was lacking this very organ which would be critical for taking care of children. Therefore, she was not responsible for her own act.
In a paper Gall published on the case, he bolstered his argument with drawings, comparing the skull of the child killer to that of a woman with many well-loved children. The child killer's skull, he pointed out, was flat in the back, while the good mother's skull had a big bulge in the same area.
And therein lies the ludicrousness of Gall in his own time and 200 years later. It's easy to look back on Gall and see how wrong he was.
Gall's problem was not so much the theory. Gall's theory was really an act of genius.
The remarkable thing was he was on the wrong road but got to the right place.
Despite his faulty reasoning and biased methodology, Gall had managed to arrive at one of the most important theories of brain science.
Gall was the beginning, the seed for Western science of cerebral localization, the basic tenet that forms the foundation of modern brain science, that different groups of brain cells perform different functions, that there are areas that do motor function, areas that do visual function, areas that do language function. Gall saw that way ahead of his time.
Unfortunately for Gall, few others appreciated the brilliance of his theory.
The church, most of the professional, scientific, and medical world were abhorrent of what he found and what he said. On Christmas Day, 1801, Francis II, the emperor, wrote Gall a letter. And in it, he essentially said that his views on the head were not appreciated, and that if he continued to pursue his viewpoint about the head, that there may be some whose heads would roll.
So Gall did what Gall had to do. He was not about to give up his science. He literally packed his bags, traveled through Germany, and eventually settled in Paris, which is where he did his best writings on the subject of organology, or phrenology, if we use the more generic term here.
But while his peers and the church had rejected Gall's theory of phrenology, the lay public embraced it.
The public fell in love with him. The public was enormously fond of this notion, and it was a sexy idea. He had a remarkably successful practice, he was a popular lecturer, he was a man about town, and he was rich.
And in the end, it was the popularity of phrenology well into the 20th century which tarnished Gall's legacy as a scientist. For he is remembered not as the father of cerebral localization, but rather as the creator of one of the most ridiculous pseudosciences in all of medical history.
Next, Jim and his doctor must make a decision how they're going to treat his epilepsy. And we'll meet a 19th century British scientist who almost went to jail for his research on the brain.
With the tests and x-rays done, Jim and his doctors now need to make a decision about how to proceed. Werner Doyle is his neurosurgeon.
In the MRI, we look for developmental abnormalities. Patients who have temporal lobe epilepsy, we're very encouraged, and we can offer a patient resective surgery.
For many epileptics, surgery, while risky, is the way to go. And if Jim's epilepsy emanated from one specific area of his brain, he would be a good candidate.
But yours doesn't. Yours is symmetric. There's no abnormalities that I can see.
Jim's alternative to surgery is a newly created device called a vagus nerve stimulator, sort of a pacemaker for the brain.
And this is the device itself with the battery and electronic components inside. And these coils, helical coils, are wrapped around the vagus nerve.
Dr. Doyle feels that Jim might benefit from this device, but it isn't a perfect solution.
It's not a cure. It improves the seizures, but in general, the majority of people, the vast majority, do not have complete resolution of their seizures.
Dr. Doyle is able to diagnose and treat Jim's illness because he has an intimate knowledge of every minute area of the brain and its function. But for much of history, there was no map of brain function. Anatomists as far back as the 16th century had dissected the brains of the dead and described their structure in great detail. But the only way to determine exactly which areas of the brain were responsible for eyesight, or for speech, or for movement, would be for someone to experiment on living brains. For several years at the end of the 1800s, a young English scientist named David Ferrier had been doing just that. And it was about to get him into a lot of trouble.
Ferrier took an extraordinarily large number of species and animals, starting with lower forms and going all the way up to monkeys. And while they were alive, probed their brains with electrical stimulation. It was as if he was playing on the keyboard of the brain to elicit brain functions.
Ferrier would injure specific areas of the animal's brains to see what functions were lost. And in doing so, he was generating a highly detailed map of brain function. Now, in the summer of 1881, he was going to go public, presenting his groundbreaking work to the world at the 7th International Medical Congress being held in London.
It was a great event. There were over 100 sessions. Estimates are that 120,000 people came to listen to these new discoveries, listen to ideas related to new discoveries in medicine.
There was much curiosity about Ferrier's work, and his presentation was attended by many of the medical luminaries of the day.
And then Ferrier took the podium, and Ferrier described two of his monkeys. He said, one of my monkeys has damage to the motor area on one side. It hobbles around like an individual who lost movement on one side of the body. He said, a second of my monkeys has bilateral damage to a part of the temporal lobe up on the top. And he said, this monkey is deaf. He can walk around, he can see things, but he cannot hear things.
While his presentation was very well received, there were those who remained skeptical, and they asked Ferrier to take them back to his lab so they could see the monkeys for themselves.
One of his monkeys came in limping, and the other one did not respond when a gunshot was sounded, showing that it was in fact stone deaf.
Some of the doctors continued to express doubt, and they made the unusual request that Ferrier let them sacrifice one of the monkeys and autopsy its brain.
The issue was, were the brain lesions where they were supposed to be?
To the collective amazement of Ferrier's audience, they were.
The monkey was found to have the damage exactly where Ferrier said it would be.
Ferrier's vivid demonstration had succeeded in convincing even the most skeptical among his audience. But it did something else. It focused a lot of attention on the controversial practice known as vivisection, research on living animals.
At this international congress, there is a vote on whether the scientific and medical community feels vivisection is something that is morally and ethically okay. And the vote is unanimous. All of the scientists and physicians present vote that it is something that should go on, and they support it.
But while the scientific community celebrated the practice, the feeling about vivisection among the lay public was far less enthusiastic.
David Ferrier was conducting his experiments on cerebral localization at a time in which the controversy over the use of living animals in experimentation was wide-ranging and greatly divided Victorian society.
As a result of that vote, there is an enormous public backlash. And in the popular mind, there are these doctors and scientists tormenting these animals.
And one group in particular was really vocal and was determined to make life hell for the experimentalists. This group was led by a woman by the name of Frances Power Cobb.
Cobb was one of the most extraordinary women, I think, of Victorian England, and a tireless critic of animal experimentation and its cruelty.
In the wake of the vote on vivisection, Cobb became consumed with bringing Ferrier down.
Frances Power Cobb actually finds a law in the books that one must have a license to perform vivisection. David Ferrier didn't have such a license.
These licenses and certificates had been recently instituted when the Parliament passed the Cruelty to Animals Act of 1876.
And question was, did Ferrier slip up? Did he violate the law?
Cobb believed that he had. And early in the autumn of 1881, she and her associates filed criminal charges against David Ferrier.
And the case went to court, and he was put on trial. And he metaphorically was on trial for the whole vivisection movement.
And indeed, many of his colleagues, his medical colleagues, attended the trial, and it was heavily covered in the Times of London and the British Medical Journal. In fact, people around the world knew what was going on, and they knew what was at stake.
That is, for the community of English physiologists, that so prominent, so eminent a scientist as David Ferrier could be harassed and brought up on charges was sort of a wake-up call.
So the first charge was read, and the charge was that Ferrier had operated without a license, without the appropriate license. Well, the people who were making the charge had not done their homework.
Now, it turns out in the course of his trial that these surgical ablations, or the cutting into the animal brains, had actually been performed by his surgical assistant, who did have the requisite licensure and certification.
Embarrassed by their oversight, the anti-vivisectionists tried to come back with various additional accusations. But theirs was a lost cause.
And the judge had had enough at this point in time, and he said, there's no violation of the law here. He was not the surgeon. The animals were not in distress. What he was doing was really well within the confines of what we find acceptable, and the trial came to a close.
With Ferrier's victory in court, the scientific community breathed a collective sigh of relief. But though the defeat may have dealt the anti-vivisectionists a momentary blow, their ranks continued to grow, and even today they remain a force to be reckoned with. As for Ferrier, his final vindication came a few years after the trial, when a surgeon named Rickman Godley approached him for help with an epileptic patient.
He was able to help the neurosurgeon Godley pinpoint the area of the brain where the seizures arose. And when the surgeon went in 1884, he found scar tissue in the exact area that Ferrier predicted, removed it, and the first successful case of epilepsy surgery was performed with Ferrier as the architect.
When we return, Jim Carella gets a pacemaker for his brain. And we'll meet two men who risked their careers by implanting the first machine in a human body.
After serious consideration, Jim Carella has decided on the vagus nerve stimulator. This morning, Dr. Doyle will implant it in Jim's chest and connect it to his vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve is just to the side of the carotid artery. By stimulating that nerve, it's a natural electrode that we can then send the signal up to the primary, primitive areas of the brain that modulate the cortex.
The actual device will deliver shocks to Jim's brain every 5 minutes, which they hope will reduce the number and severity of his seizures.
That's where you make a small incision and place the electrode. All right, let's have the generator. I'm going to stick this in and close the pocket up.
Before Dr. Doyle closes the incision, he needs to make sure the device is working.
Okay, let's test it out. We are on the money. James, operation's over. It's in. And it's on.
While the idea of shocking the brain with an implanted device verges on science fiction, it's really not a new idea. In fact, electricity as a treatment has been around for 2,000 years. In the 1st century, the Greeks had people stand on electric torpedo fish to treat everything from the pain of gout to headaches. And the Arabs and the Chinese later used electric catfish to treat facial palsies. Then, in the mid-1700s, Benjamin Franklin flew his famous kite. And not long after came the first crude battery. These advances brought with them a dizzying array of machines and contraptions which were supposed to cure virtually every ailment known to man, and some of which even claimed to bring the dead back to life. The only problem was, most of these devices did nothing. It was only in the 20th century that electricity finally moved out of the realm of quackery and became a legitimate medical tool. And a Swedish engineer named Arne Larsson became one of its first beneficiaries. Larsson had been a strong, strapping man, an athlete, a father, and a successful businessman. Then in the mid-1950s, he contracted a viral infection which caused scarring in his heart, disrupting its normal function. It left this once vigorous man a bedridden invalid.
He was being treated at the Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm, one of the great institutions of the world.
And he has what are known as Stokes-Adams attacks, and his heart rate got down into the 20s, I think.
And that's a heart block, which is really not a failure of the heart per se, but the failure of the electrical system within the heart.
His heart would stop, and people would have to thump on his chest, his family and other people. And they had to keep him alive that way, time and time and time again.
He seemed to be getting much worse. His wife despaired of his survival.
But as bad as Larsson's condition was, many felt that the treatments then available were even worse.
At that time, we employed something that today would be a torture chamber, an external pacemaker, which means that an electrode was placed on the front of the chest and connected to a monitor. When the heart stops, a jolt, an electric jolt, was delivered to the heart, and the heart started.
And indeed, it was awful. They were developing burns on the chest from this electrolyte solution, in which the electricity passing through the electrolyte paste, actually, into the chest produced even more burns.
By 1956, doctors began inserting the wires directly into the patient's heart through the chest wall.
These wires were attached to these primitive external pacemakers, and the wires would break, and infection was certainly a problem.
Larsson's doctors considered the risk of infection too serious to use an external pacemaker. So, after 6 months in the hospital, Arne Larsson needed a miracle. As fate would have it, just down the hall at the Karolinska Hospital, a heart surgeon named Åke Senning and an engineer named Rune Elmqvist were working on a revolutionary new device, a cardiac pacemaker that could be implanted in the body. In the summer of 1958, they were in the early stages of experimenting on animals and not nearly ready to put it into a human being. But when Arne Larsen's wife found out about this, she begged them to help her dying husband.
Arne Larsen's wife desperately pleaded for them to either speed up their research or to take shortcuts and go ahead and try what they had at the time, because she knew and he knew what the risks were.
But I said, please, please, you must try, you must do it. And then after a while he said, I will talk with Dr. Elmqvist and we will come back to you.
Dr. Senning wanted to help. The problem was they hadn't actually made a pacemaker yet. Elmqvist would have to create one.
Elmqvist designed the pacemaker with rechargeable batteries, nickel-cadmium rechargeable batteries, a single brand new transistor. It was just being introduced at that time, and potted it in epoxy resin and used as a mold for the entire device an empty shoe polish can.
It wasn't planned, but they were responding to an emergency. And that is what happens in research so often, that you respond to a patient's request that there's nothing else that can be done. The patient is willing to join in an experiment.
On the morning of October 8, 1958, Dr. Senning implanted the first prototype pacemaker in Arne Larsen's chest. With her husband's heart beating soundly, Mrs. Larsen went home to get some rest. But her relief was short-lived.
I went home about 12 o'clock in the night, and at 2 o'clock I phoned the hospital. And the nurse told me, when I said who I was, Mrs. Larsen, I will ask for Dr. Senning. And then, when you get that answer, you already know that something is wrong.
Perfect.
And indeed, something was wrong. After only a few hours, the pacemaker had failed. Fortunately, Elmqvist had made a single backup, and at 8 o'clock the next morning, they used it to replace the first failed pacemaker. Luckily, this one worked. But for Larsen, keeping his heart beating would be a lifelong odyssey.
Over the course of the next several decades, he had more than 20 or 30 different versions of pacemakers inserted to keep his heart going.
He received progressively improved units to the very end, and did very well with them, and did not die of cardiac disease.
In fact, on December 28, 2001, Arne Larsen died from skin cancer at the age of 86. By all rights, he should have died 43 years earlier, and it shouldn't have been cancer that killed him. But by a stroke of serendipity, Larsen had been a man in the right place at the right time.
When Mr. Larsen died in 2001, he had outlived Dr. Senning, Mr. Almquist, and all that time, the pacemaker beat more than 1 billion times.
Now this same technology is pacing Jim Carella's brain. But it's too soon yet to know what effect the vagus nerve stimulator will have on his epilepsy. It's been 6 months since it was implanted, and while his headaches and the severity of his seizures have diminished, it could take another year before its full effects are felt.
Finding a cure for epilepsy has been like solving a puzzle with many players, each of them supplying an invaluable clue. And though its cause remains elusive and its cures are often incomplete, history's lesson is that we will likely find the answer, but probably not where or when we expect to. For the History Channel, I'm Noah Wiley. Infectious diseases. They've been humanity's greatest scourge, and it's taken medicine thousands of years to begin to tame them. As our recent experience with SARS has shown, even with the knowledge and tools that quickly led to identifying the virus, we're still vulnerable to its spread. Hi, I'm Noah Wiley. Welcome to Mavericks, Miracles in Medicine, the stories of the people behind history's greatest medical discoveries, and the incredible challenges they often faced in making them. Our program begins with Christopher, an 18-month-old boy at the center of a medical mystery. He has tuberculosis, but no one knows how he got it. And whoever gave it to him could be spreading it to others. Surprisingly, the key to understanding how infectious diseases are spread didn't come until the late 19th century. But when it finally did, TB played a central role in cracking this medical mystery.
Christopher is 18 months old. He and his parents recently moved here from Ecuador. Little did they know that they would soon become the central players in a medical mystery. A routine skin test run during his one-year checkup showed that Christopher had been exposed to tuberculosis.
So, isolation only until after we have tested the parents.
TB is a highly contagious disease made all the more dangerous because it's often invisible.
It is important that we will try to see if this is really inside his body, in his lungs.
Though he looks healthy enough, the danger to Christopher is very real. Left untreated, TB can be highly destructive and even fatal.
Has the baby had any cough at all?
TB is spread through close contact, so if Christopher has been exposed, someone close to him must have it. The problem is, neither of Christopher's parents appear to be ill.
We do a lot of what we think of as detective work. Has anybody come from Ecuador to visit?
Today, doctors and public health workers have the tools to investigate the mystery of who gave Christopher TB, and when they're found, to treat them before they infect others. But in the late 1800s, this kind of sleuthing wasn't even an option. Because although TB was the world's leading cause of death, no one knew how anybody got it.
They basically believed that you inherited weak lungs from your mother or your father, and that you could resist this family tendency by taking very good care of yourself. It was not believed to be a contagious or communicable disease.
In fact, weird and inaccurate theories abounded about how all disease was spread.
People believed that infectious diseases could be brought about by an unhealthy spell of weather, that it would be very cold followed by very hot.
It could be religious ideas that people had done something wrong, God was punishing. It could be gaseous emanations.
In fact, some people believe that some of the mists and vapors that came off dams and lakes were responsible, and various other theories.
By the late 1800s, many of the great minds of science had begun to believe that microscopic organisms, germs, might be responsible for transmitting disease, but no one had been able to prove it. Then, in 1882, in a laboratory at the Imperial Health Institute in Berlin, a young German doctor named Robert Koch did what none of them could. Koch succeeded for the first time in proving that a germ was responsible for causing a disease in human beings, and the disease was tuberculosis.
You almost can't imagine what it was like today, because no one had any idea before what caused this awful thing, and here suddenly someone demonstrates it.
It was in fact the absolute proof that that a germ actually that caused an illness in humans.
This earth-shattering discovery brought worldwide notoriety to a man who, only a few years before, had been an obscure small-town practitioner.
The strange thing was that he was a country doctor, and then he saw all these animals in this country area that were dying of anthrax. And then one day, just with his wife as an assistant, in a little area partitioned off in his consulting room, he decided to have a look and culture the material that was obtained from animals dying of anthrax.
With a series of simple yet extraordinary experiments, Koch had isolated the anthrax germ and proven that it alone was responsible for the disease. Now, 6 years later, he had discovered the germ for tuberculosis and proven once and for all what came to be known as the germ theory. Armed with this new knowledge, he set out to isolate the causes of some of humanity's most formidable enemies.
He knocked off these great discoveries one after another. Anthrax was one. Isolating and growing the tubercle bacillus, proving the germ theory of disease. It takes your breath away.
In short order, he and his disciples went on to identify the causes of cholera, diphtheria, typhoid, and syphilis, to name but a few.
It was really a landmark, period. When they finally realized that it was germs, microorganisms of various kinds, any of these could cause disease, they knew better what to look for. And as time went on, you could then begin to think in terms of treatments because you knew what you were aiming at.
And after 8 years of incredible success isolating germs, Koch now felt tremendous pressure to come up with cures. And that pressure only grew when in 1890 he was invited to be the honored presenter at an international medical congress in Berlin.
The German government, because of Koch's fame with tuberculosis, they were hoping for something even bigger, that is, a treatment for tuberculosis, because it's one thing to discover the organism, but it's quite another thing to treat it and cure it.
And Koch didn't disappoint them. In his presentation, he reported at length on his experiments with a substance he called tuberculin, and he closed his remarks by saying, "I have at last hit upon a substance that has the power of preventing the growth of tubercle bacilli."
He kind of announced in an indirect way that he had discovered that tuberculin can prevent tuberculosis, or he sort of worded it in a vague way, but people immediately believed him.
And of course, his fame made everyone believe it. It was front-page news throughout the world because the disease was and is still a huge scourge.
Requests poured in from all over the world for samples of his new TB cure. There was only one problem: tuberculin didn't work.
It turns out that tuberculin makes people worse, not better.
He hadn't really tested it. He just sort of had a hunch and some preliminary experiments.
And in fact, that resulted in really hundreds of deaths, it's estimated, from tuberculosis that would not have occurred otherwise.
Few people could have survived a scandal of this magnitude, but Koch did.
If he had not been as famous as he was, he probably would have been wiped out. But it was his history of what he had accomplished before that saved him.
In fact, it more than saved him. Even after the scandal, the German government made him head of his own institute for the study of infectious disease. And in 1905, for his investigations and discoveries in relation to tuberculosis, Robert Koch was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine.
When we return, Christopher's doctors will take the painstaking steps to determine whether he actually has TB. And we'll meet a man with no scientific training who shocked the medical world with what he saw through his microscope.
The first focus of the investigation of Christopher's TB is, does he actually have the disease? This is the easy part. A chest X-ray shows that, though they've apparently caught it early, there is clear evidence of TB in Christopher's lungs. Now, his doctors need to determine what strain of TB he has and how to cure it. To answer these questions, they'll need to grow Christopher's germs in the laboratory, then test their sensitivity to various drugs. The impressive technology which will aid the technicians in identifying and visualizing the microscopic invader in Christopher's body is state-of-the-art 21st century. But none of it would have been possible without the unlikely 17th century explorer who first described the microscopic world. It is often said of the leading lights in the history of medicine that they made their discoveries standing on the shoulders of giants. They studied in grand institutions, learned from great minds, and built on the insights and observations of those who came before them. Anton van Leeuwenhoek is a glaring exception. Totally unschooled in medicine or science, he made his extraordinary discoveries using only his eyes, his imagination, and a tiny hand-fashioned microscope.
Interesting thing about van Leeuwenhoek was that by occupation he was a draper. He had a quaint draper's store, and he was also a part-time janitor. And the thing is this, he became interested in making microscopes.
Anton van Leeuwenhoek was born and raised in the small Dutch town of Delft in the latter half of the 1600s. At the age of 30, he began grinding lenses and making rudimentary microscopes as a hobby.
Most people do believe that van Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope. Actually, Zacharias Janssen was the first to describe the principles of the microscope in 1590. For 50 years, in fact, before van Leeuwenhoek, people were looking through microscopes. There was a big difference in that what everyone else was looking at were things that they could see with their eyes, and they were just using the microscope to look at them more clearly.
What Leeuwenhoek did was much more remarkable.
He first started grinding lenses. Why? Who knows? You know, this comes from a deep part of his being that you can't explain. And then he had the sense to use these lenses to look where no one had looked before. If you can make any principle about making a scientific discovery, one of them is to use a new instrument, to look where people haven't looked before. And this was exactly what Leeuwenhoek had done and what he did. And what he found was quite surprising.
He decided to look at some rainwater that had stood for several days. And when he looked there, he was absolutely amazed. He saw little animals that were moving around from place to place. And he was absolutely amazed.
He looked at semen, at pond scum, and he found and identified many different types of organisms.
He looked at his own blood and saw for the first time red blood cells. In addition to that, he looked at his own semen. And then he saw these little wiggling, strange wiggling creatures in there, which he described.
A natural-born researcher, he meticulously documented what he found. And in the early 1670s, he began writing letters to the Royal Society in London describing his work. One letter began, "I discovered little creatures in rain, which had stood but a few days in a new tub that was painted blue within." He went on to describe all the incredible things he had observed through his lens. The members of the Royal Society were less than receptive.
Professional scientists are always contemptuous of people they consider to be interlopers. It was no different in Leeuwenhoek's time than it is today. Here was a man, a draper in Holland, not known to these people in London who had made their names in science. What are they going to think?
The members of the society reacted with thinly veiled hostility. "Here is this letter from this unlearned Dutch draper whom we really don't know," they wrote, in which he claims to have detected thousands of animals in a tiny drop of rainwater. He must send us verification of these findings by others whom we can trust.
So all the notables of the town came and looked through the microscope, including his clergymen and so on. They then wrote a letter to the Royal Society and said that what he was saying was true.
When he showed his guests vinegar under the microscope, some of them were so disgusted by the spectacle that they vowed they'd never use vinegar again. Leeuwenhoek would later write, "What if one should tell such people in future that there are more animals living in the scum on the teeth in a man's mouth than there are men in the whole kingdom?" Even if they found Leeuwenhoek's discoveries disgusting, everyone wanted to peek into the world hiding under his microscope.
Royalty from all over Europe visited his draper's shop in order to look through his microscope and to see the invisible world. And in fact, Queen Mary of England visited his draper's shop to come and look through his microscope.
Finally, after Leeuwenhoek had submitted dozens of papers to the Royal Society, and Robert Hooke, the Society's own microscopist, confirmed Leeuwenhoek's findings, the august body which had originally shunned him accepted him as one of their own.
He was the only uneducated draper and part-time janitor ever to become a Fellow of the Royal Society of London.
But it would take 200 years until Robert Koch proved the germ theory of disease for the world to understand the significance of the organisms that populated the world Leeuwenhoek saw under his microscope.
When we next see Christopher, his doctors will begin the hunt for answers to the bigger mystery. How did he get TB? And we'll meet one of medical history's most notorious and contagious outlaws.
These women are medical detectives, and they have a mystery to solve. Who gave little Christopher TB? Because whoever gave him this disease is still out there, potentially spreading germs and infecting others. So these caseworkers from the National TB Center here in Newark have come to Christopher's house today to start their search by questioning the most obvious candidate, his mother. Do you have a cough? Have you lost weight recently? Who else lives in the house with Christopher? Who visits regularly? Who babysits? Every close contact must be identified and found, and all of them will be given a PPD, the skin test for TB.
It's a state law that they have to be tested and have to see a doctor and have to have a chest x-ray. So everybody
starting with Christopher's mother. Christopher's family is more than willing to cooperate in this search. But what happens when a carrier doesn't want to be found? Almost 100 years ago, one such person became the best-known outlaw in the history of public health. In 1907, New York City was a bustling urban environment teeming with streetcars, commerce, and new immigrants from all over the world. It was also a hotbed of contagious disease. One of the worst public health problems of the time was typhoid fever. About 5,000 New Yorkers were coming down with the disease every year, and many would die from it. So it wasn't a huge shock when a New York family renting a summer house on Long Island fell victim to an outbreak of typhoid fever. The only problem was, nobody could figure out how they got it.
It turns out nobody else in Oyster Bay that summer was sick. Although they went around and they asked everybody who ate the seafood in the bay, because very often seafood can be medium for transmitting typhoid fever. They checked the water supply in the house. Everything was negative, so it was a mystery.
In desperation, they hired a freelance public health investigator named George Soper.
He tested every person in the household, and they all tested negative. And he was really flummoxed, because not only was the environment not the cause, and the fish in the bay were not the cause, and the people in the house were not the cause.
Soper couldn't figure out how this disease had made its way into the house.
He asked again, was there anybody else around this house this summer who could have been the transmitter? And one of the family members said, oh, yeah, of course, we had a cook.
The cook, it turned out, was a young Irish woman named Mary Mallon. Since coming to America, she had made her living cooking for the wealthy families of New York City, often accompanying them to their various vacation homes in the summer. So Mary was the only possible suspect. But there was a problem. As much as any of the family could remember, Mary had been as healthy as a horse.
They didn't know about healthy carriers. They didn't know that there were people who could be carrying the microorganism, typhoid being the classic example, and could be completely healthy and come into contact with you and give you typhoid.
But as it happened, George Soper did know about healthy carriers.
He had read an article in German, it turns out, by Robert Koch, the article that Koch had published in 1902, positing that healthy carriers, people who had recovered from typhoid fever, could transmit the disease to other people. And Soper, since he had looked at every other possible source for this household outbreak, decided he must have a healthy carrier on his hands.
If someone, especially a cook, could appear totally healthy, be totally healthy, and still give typhoid to others, Soper knew this was a serious threat.
And he went to the employment agency through which the Warren family had found her, and he traced her cooking experiences back as far as he could, and I think he got 7 or 8 families prior to the Warren family for whom she had cooked, and in every one of them he had found an outbreak of typhoid fever.
Soper finally traced Mary to a home in Manhattan, went there unannounced, knocked on the door, and asked to speak to the cook.
He says to her, "I think you've been causing typhoid fever everywhere you've been cooking, making people sick, and killing a few people. I want specimens of your blood, your urine, and your feces." Well, she thought the man was mad. And he was. In her terms, absolutely mad.
She simply could not believe that she was sick, that she represented a danger to other people.
Most of the scientists and medical people of the time who hadn't read Koch's paper in America, they would have also thought it was a bit crazy. How could this happen?
You had to be willing to believe in a certain kind of laboratory evidence that the average American was not going to believe in.
So she threw him out of the house with a fork in her hand, kitchen fork, threw him out of the house. Wouldn't hear of it, just wouldn't hear of it.
Soper was certain that Mallon was responsible for the outbreaks and took his evidence to the New York City Health Department. They were sufficiently convinced to send a young doctor named Josephine Baker and a team of police to pick Mary up for testing.
She comes out screaming and tearing at everybody in sight and extremely upset. And at 5 police officers coming to get you, anybody would be that upset. But she fought them tooth and nail every bit of the way. They got her into the ambulance. Dr. Baker sat on her, literally sat on her. She said it was like being in a cage with an angry lion. That's what Mary Mallon was like at that point.
As Soper had suspected, the tests revealed that Mary Mallon was a healthy carrier of typhoid, the first they had ever seen. Much to her chagrin, she was taken to an isolation hospital for tuberculosis patients on North Brother Island off Manhattan. And when the local press got a hold of the story, they had a field day.
2-page spread in the New York American with a big drawing of Mary Mallon in her apron with a skillet in her hand, and she is dropping not eggs into the skillet, but human skulls into the skillet. So you get a vision of a cook, but a cook who kills through her cooking.
The article dubbed her Typhoid Mary, a name that would come to symbolize danger and disease, and it stuck. Health officials wanted to keep her locked up. But just when it seemed that she would spend her life rotting away in isolation, her luck changed. After 3 years, a new health commissioner decided to give her her freedom if she made him one promise: she must never work as a cook again.
So she takes him up on it, the health department offer, and she signs a note saying she won't cook for other people and that she'll stay in touch with the health department, and they release her.
And this might have been the last anyone ever heard about Typhoid Mary, if not for an outbreak of typhoid at a maternity hospital in New York City in 1915. When the health department investigated, they found that the cook, who called herself Mrs. Brown, was none other than Mary Mallon, Typhoid Mary. This time, the court threw the book at her, and she was put back in Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island.
The Mary Mallon story illustrates a very important public health dilemma that was true in the early 20th century and is still true in the early 21st century. And that is, how do you protect the public's health at the same time as you protect civil liberties of individuals?
In Malin's case, they chose to protect the public by leaving her on the island for the rest of her life. She finally died there of a stroke in 1938.
When we return, we'll see if Chris's doctors have caught their culprit, the source of his TB. And we'll meet the unsung heroine in the battle against infectious disease.
So let's talk about this little kid.
It's been a week since Christopher was first brought to the hospital for tests.
Well, we know that this kid has a positive skin test, he has an abnormal x-ray. There's no question that he has TB.
Yes, yes.
The team responsible for his case still has unanswered questions.
This is a puzzle, this is a mystery. Where was this child infected?
The mother had a PPD done, and the PPD was negative. And the father also had a PPD done, and also the PPD was also negative.
One thing we can say is that this little child didn't catch his TB from any of these people. Anybody is a suspect until the true culprit is named.
The public health measures being taken by Dr. Reichman and his staff are currently their only weapon against a full-blown outbreak of TB. Because while we know how to treat it, there is no reliable, safe vaccine against it. Now imagine a world where infectious plagues ran rampant with no cure or preventative for any of them. For most of human history, that was the case, until the incredible discovery that you could use a disease to stop a disease. The disease was known as the speckled monster, smallpox. A scourge throughout recorded time, its reach was once so great that the fates of whole peoples and nations were inexorably altered by this dread disease. Smallpox killed Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. It's believed responsible for wiping out the Aztecs, and many of the royal heads of Europe had succumbed to its power. By the dawn of the 18th century, smallpox had replaced bubonic plague as Europe's most feared disease. That this scourge doesn't continue to the present is generally credited to one man, an English country doctor named Edward Jenner, who discovered the vaccine for smallpox at the end of the 18th century. But in fact, for centuries before Jenner, an effective preventative for smallpox already existed.
The Indians and Chinese, at least 1,000 years previously, prevented smallpox by taking material from the scab of someone who had suffered from smallpox, grinding it up, and they then inhaled it into the nostril. But then it spread to the Arab world, where they actually used to scratch material taken from a smallpox pustule into the arm of a person.
You would think that this age-old practice, which came to be known as variolation, would have been adopted worldwide, but in fact, it was having an awful time making its way to the Western world. And it might never have, if not for an unusually persistent English noblewoman called Lady Mary.
Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was one of the remarkable women of the early 1700s. She wrote poetry, she wrote prose, she was a member of the aristocracy, she was married to a lord, a British lord, and therefore she was Lady Mary. She hobnobbed with all of the intellectual greats.
And she was one of smallpox's more illustrious survivors.
Prior to developing smallpox, she was regarded as one of the most beautiful women in Britain, and in fact Alexander Pope wrote a poem about her. Before that, all the paintings of her were done close up. After that, they were all done with her in the distance, under trees or something like that, because these ugly scars on her face.
In 1717, Lady Mary accompanied her husband to his post as British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire.
And it was while she was in Turkey that she learned about variolation. She had one of her children variolated to protect against smallpox. She wrote letters back to England calling attention to this practice.
She wrote with enthusiasm to her friend Sarah Chiswell. Dear Sarah, I'm going to tell you a thing that will make you wish yourself here. The smallpox, so fatal and so general amongst us, is here entirely harmless by the invention of ingrafting, which is the term they give it. I am patriot enough, she concluded, to take pains to bring this useful invention into fashion in England. And true to her words, she did.
When she came back to England, she decided that she would have her second child variolated and protected. And she got a very famous London physician to do the practice. And from what I understand, it was observed by a number of members of the Royal Medical Society.
This event piqued the interest of Lady Mary's most influential friend, the Princess of Wales.
In about 1720, a new smallpox epidemic hit England. And at that point, the Prince and Princess of Wales were worried about their two daughters.
But although Lady Mary had had her children successfully variolated, the royals were still wary of the practice and wanted proof that the procedure would be safe for their little girls. They came up with a plan which today would be considered utterly barbaric, not to mention illegal. With the permission of the king, they procured 6 condemned prisoners and had their physicians variolate them, with the promise that if they lived, they would be pardoned. Luckily for them, they survived. But what the royals did next was even more outrageous.
In order to test whether children react the same as adults, they got children from an orphanage and they tested them by inoculating them, and that seemed to go well. And it was only then that they decided that it was safe enough to do on the royal princesses.
And one would think that with this royal stamp of approval, the practice would finally have caught on.
But in point of fact, not too many people in the decades after that, even when smallpox came and went, were inoculated.
The problem was, variolation itself was a risky proposition, as it involved giving someone smallpox to prevent smallpox.
The term variolation comes from the word variola, which means smallpox.
With variolation, one might become very ill, and the occasional person even died.
It was a very dangerous technique.
In addition, variolation, at least as it was practiced in Europe, was an extremely unpleasant experience. And it may have been fortuitous that in 1757, a young English orphan boy named Edward Jenner found out just how unpleasant it was.
When he was 8 years old, there was the smallpox epidemic. And actually, in those days, the physicians in Britain had the weird idea that people had to be starved and purged for 6 weeks before they were variolated. And so there was poor Jenner, a terrified 8-year-old youngster, starved and purged for 6 weeks and then variolated.
There's no way to know whether this awful experience played a role in Jenner's choice of careers, but he went on to become a doctor and ultimately achieved international renown for his discovery of the safer, more effective smallpox vaccine, which may explain why Jenner's is a household name, while few of us have heard of the courageous and persistent English noblewoman who came before him.
Coming up, even without knowing the source of his TB, Christopher's doctors must begin his treatment with life-saving drugs. Drugs that have a rather unfortunate family history.
Diane Collins is a warrior against TB, and every day she deals the disease a small but critical blow. Today, she's going out to Christopher's house to give him his daily dose of medication, something she'll do 5 days a week for the next 6 months. Diane and her colleagues do this for every one of the more than 100 TB patients in the Newark area. It's called directly observed therapy.
He might try to resist a little bit, but he'll get used to it. So, but he needs to get this, so it's very important that we get it into him, okay?
It's necessary because TB is a sneaky enemy. And if people don't take the full course of medication, the germs that weren't killed off early, the strongest ones, survive, multiply, and get passed on to others. And now they're resistant to the drugs.
That's it, all gone.
Luckily, Christopher's disease was caught early, and there are medications that can help him. But not long ago, this story would have gone very differently. Even as recently as World War I, doctors were forced to sit by powerless as patients died of tuberculosis or cholera or pneumonia. Finally, in 1928, the English scientist Alexander Fleming changed the world when he happened to notice that a mold growing in a culture in his lab had killed the bacteria around it. What he had discovered was penicillin. This extraordinary drug, the first antibiotic, would sound a death knell to many of the world's most fearsome diseases. But unfortunately, it proved useless against the scourge of tuberculosis. And when a cure for the dreaded TB was finally found, the controversy surrounding its discovery would turn into an ugly battle over credit, money, and even the Nobel Prize. The story began innocently enough in a small agricultural laboratory at Rutgers University in New Jersey. The main character was a brilliant, if tyrannical, Russian immigrant named Selman Waxman.
Science in those days, one had research teams and the professor. Like in Europe, there was only one professor, and everyone respected the professor who directed all projects. He was God, and everyone gave respect to the professor.
Waxman was pursuing a lifelong obsession, studying microbes in the soil. And far from looking for wonder drugs, his mission was the improvement of agriculture. But when penicillin came along, Waxman saw the future.
Waxman was very impressed to hear about the penicillin. It really worked. And so he really said, we can show these Englishmen.
Waxman was convinced that the cure for tuberculosis and other diseases that penicillin couldn't kill was in the very soil he'd spent his life studying. He and his staff began a long and tedious search.
What they were trying to do was to isolate different types of microorganisms that could produce a chemical that could kill other microorganisms.
A group of graduate students worked in Waxman's laboratory, and two of them would play pivotal roles in the drama that would soon unfold. One was named Albert Schatz.
Albert Schatz was clearly a very devoted, hard-working graduate student. He often stayed late at night, slept at the lab. He screened everything, they said. It didn't matter what it was, he screened it.
The other graduate student was a young woman named Elizabeth Bugy.
My mom did a lot of work for Waxman. She was his lead technician, an extremely organized and meticulous person. And in those days, in the 40s, there were not very many women going into science at all.
Waxman and his students spent the next 3 years searching for new antibiotics. Finally, after thousands of experiments, in 1943, Albert Schatz found that a mold called Streptomyces griseus could kill the germ responsible for tuberculosis. And from it, they isolated a drug which they called streptomycin. The Rutgers team was jubilant, and in short order, they published a paper announcing their discovery to the world.
There were 3 people on that paper: Selman Waxman, who was the head of the lab, my mother, and Albert Schatz. And so those 3 are credited with the discovery of streptomycin.
But almost before the ink was dry on their groundbreaking publication, this miraculous discovery became embroiled in controversy.
What's really not known by a lot of people is some of the things that went behind this whole story. And it's one of the sad stories, I think, of research.
The first in a series of questionable events surrounding the discovery occurred almost immediately.
They applied for patent along with Merck to get the royalty rights to this particular drug because they felt that it would have some clinical significance.
The names on the patent were Selman Waksman and Albert Schatz. Elizabeth Bugey's name was absent.
The only time that she ever talked about this was once she told my sister that she had been asked by both of them to give up her rights to the patent and to sign a piece of paper saying that she had nothing to do with the discovery of streptomycin. And the rationale for this was, according to my mother, that they explained to her that she was a female, that she would be soon marrying, having children, and dropping out of the field, and therefore her reputation was not going to be that important. She did sign that paper, and so her name does not appear on the patent.
So now it was just Waksman and Schatz. And as streptomycin was likely to be a huge seller, they both stood to get very rich. But in 1946, in an apparent act of selflessness, Waksman approached Schatz with the idea that they should donate their royalties to the university.
Originally, the understanding was that all of the royalties that were obtained from streptomycin would go to a new foundation that was established at Rutgers University.
This institute now serves as a center for scientists from all over the world and is dedicated to the free pursuit of knowledge for the benefit of all mankind.
Albert Schatz had been asked to sign away his patent rights to the Rutgers Research Foundation, and had done so quite willingly.
Schatz did this believing that Waksman had done the same.
What actually happened is a portion of that money went to Waksman.
Apparently, Albert Schatz found out about this and was quite upset. And so in 1950, he sued Waksman over the royalties that he was getting.
Waksman took this as a personal affront, and it turned into an acrimonious court battle.
He never had had anybody challenge him as regards, well, I discovered this particular one. And Albert Schatz simply said, well, I did discover streptomycin, and I am on the patent.
In his court statement, Waksman argued that Schatz was not a co-discoverer of streptomycin, but simply one of many students who happened to be there at the finish.
Schatz was portrayed by Waksman and others as a malcontent, a crank, unstable personality. And it was very unjust to Schatz, because I think Schatz really deserved equal credit in the development of streptomycin.
Schatz was victorious. In a groundbreaking settlement, Waksman was forced to acknowledge him as co-discoverer of the drug, and Schatz was awarded $125,000 plus royalties. The court further ordered compensation for all the other workers associated with the discovery.
My mother was one of those people and did receive 0.3% of the royalties.
Though its birth was tainted by greed and scandal, streptomycin went on to save untold thousands of lives.
This is the biggest killer the world has ever known, and finally there was a means of attacking it, and this was what people had never dreamt possible at all.
In the end, that fact seems to have obscured the ugliness that came before. And in 1952, Selman Waksman, and Waksman alone, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Referring to his lifelong body of work and the discovery of streptomycin, the Nobel Committee said, "As physicians, we regard you as one of the greatest benefactors to mankind." After 6 months of daily medication, Christopher is now a healthy 2-year-old. But the mystery has never been solved. Health workers were never able to identify the carrier. Nonetheless, until a safe and effective vaccine against TB is found, they remain the last best defense against the spread of this terrible disease.
It's fitting that the hunt for the dreaded germ reads like a detective novel, complete with a steady stream of plot twists and villains. The latest example is SARS, and before that, West Nile and AIDS. But like any good mystery, medical or otherwise, the most valuable clues often come from the most unlikely sources. For the History Channel, I'm Noah Wiley.